Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning story 1, the city beneath the trees, Cahokia and the Mississippians. When you picture North America before 1492, you might imagine vast forests, scattered villages, or nomadic tribes chasing herds across wide plains. But buried in the silence of the Mississippi River floodplain is a memory of something different, something forgotten, yet once monumental. This was Cahokia. Before the idea of St. Louis, long before French traders or Spanish swords, there stood a city of earth, wood, and human effort. Cahokia, as archaeologists now call it, was the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica, yet not a single resident left a written record of its name. The Great Mound Builders. At its peak around 1050–1200 CE, the Mississippian city of Cahokia may have housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people, comparable to many medieval European cities at the same time. Located near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, it sprawled across nearly 6 square miles. And rising at its heart was Monk's Mound, a massive earthwork covering 14 acres at its base, 100 feet tall, requiring over 15 million baskets of earth to build. The people of Cahokia were not nomads. They were engineers, planners, and farmers. Their world was not a wilderness, it was designed. Radiating outward from the central plaza, their homes were constructed with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, organized into neighborhoods and connected by causeways. They built not only for shelter but for symbolism. Some mounds were flat-topped and supported wooden temples or homes of leaders. Others were conical, perhaps used for burials or rituals. Together, they created a city skyline unlike anything else in pre-Columbian North America. Yet, built with earth rather than stone, time slowly returned them to the land. A calendar made of wood and sky. Near the city's central complex stood a circle of tall wooden posts, what modern archaeologists call woodhen. Carefully placed in alignment with the solstices and equinoxes, these posts functioned as a solar calendar. On key dates, the rising sun would appear between the wooden markers, announcing the changing seasons to a people whose lives depended on the rhythms of nature. But Woodhenge wasn't simply a tool. It was also a stage for ceremony, watched by thousands who gathered in silence or song. The alignment of stars, sun, and shadow told stories written not in ink, but in light stories that guided planting, harvest, and belief. In a society without books, calendars were carved into memory and monument. The Mississippian world. Cahokia didn't stand alone. Across what is now the southeastern United States, other mound-building societies flourished. From Etowah in Georgia to Moundville in Alabama, from Spiro in Oklahoma to the lesser-known sites of Arkansas and Tennessee, a web of connected Mississippian cultures traded goods, ideas, and rituals. Cahokia was a hub in this network. Shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and mica from the Appalachians have all been found at the site, proof of long-distance trade. Tools, feathers, pigments, and exotic minerals passed through human hands, often along river routes that acted like watery highways. What's striking is how much the Mississippians managed without the wheel, draft animals, or written language. Roads were human paths. Burdens were carried on backs. Memory was oral, sacred, and precise. The food that made it possible. So what fed a city like Cahokia? The answer lies in the trio of crops known as the Three Sisters: corn, maize, beans, and squash. Grown together in complementary fashion, corn providing structure, beans adding nitrogen, squash covering the soil, these crops were both nutritionally and agriculturally efficient. Add in fish from the rivers, deer from the forests, and wild berries and nuts, and you have a rich and varied diet. Corn, especially, changed everything. Though first domesticated in Mesoamerica, maize spread northward over centuries, and by 900 CE it had become central to Mississippian life. With agriculture, people could settle in one place, organize labor, and build cities. But agriculture also meant hierarchy. Some stored grain, others toiled in fields. Some led rituals atop the mounds, others watched from below. A society of roles and symbols. Cahokia was not egalitarian. Evidence suggests a stratified society, with powerful elites, specialized craftsmen, religious leaders, and farmers. Burials in mounds reveal vast disparities. Some individuals interred with copper plates, shell beads, and fine tools, others with none. One burial, now referred to as the Birdman burial, featured a man laid atop 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Who was he? A ruler, a priest, a warrior? We don't know, but someone of immense importance. Symbols were everywhere. Birds, especially falcons, crosses and circles, the hand and eye. These motifs repeated on pottery, shell engravings, and stone carvings. The meanings are partly lost, but the consistency suggests a shared cosmology, a world of sky beings, underworld spirits, and an ordered universe in which ritual kept chaos at bay. Homes, crafts, and everyday work. For most of Cahokia's people, life was work. Men and women labored in fields, constructed homes, crafted tools from stone and bone, and created pottery for storage and cooking. Children learned by watching and mimicking. Grandparents passed down oral tales. Neighbors built homes together. Homes were simple but structured. Wooden posts sunk into the earth, plastered with mud and clay, roofed with grass or bark. Inside, family members slept on reed mats, cooked over central hearths, and stored food in woven baskets or clay jars. Craftspeople shaped tools with skill. Chipped flint knives, polished stone celts, and shell gorgets suggest a culture of refined utilitarianism. They didn't build with grandeur, but with persistence. Nothing was wasted. Bones became awls, shells became beads, feathers adorned ceremonial wear. A city's strange silence. And then something changed. By 1350 CE, the city began to decline. Population dropped. Construction stopped. The great plazas grew quiet. By 1400, Cahokia was largely abandoned. Why? No single answer satisfies. Climate shifts may have caused crop failures. Overhunting and deforestation could have exhausted local resources. Floods may have worsened. Social unrest, too, is possible, people questioning the elite's power when ceremonies no longer brought rain or game. Perhaps it was all of these, a slow unraveling. But one fact remains. When European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley a century later, they found scattered villages but no cities like Cahokia. Its memory had faded, even among descendants. The mounds remained, covered in grass and trees, mistaken for natural hills or burial places of giants. It would be centuries before archaeologists began to understand what had once stood there. The question that remains. So you might be wondering, how could such a large city richer in culture than many imagine vanish from common memory? And more curiously still, what did the last generation of Cahokians believe was happening as their world quietly emptied around them? When you hear civilization, you might think of marble buildings, dusty libraries, and written records. But in Cahokia, civilization was woven from soil, sky, and the shared memory of a people who never wrote anything down. In this section, we settle into the slower rhythms of daily life in Cahokia, where the sacred and the practical lived side by side. This isn't a tale of kings and conquests. It's about how people lived when the forest gave way to farmland, when rivers were highways, and when every sunrise meant another chance to tend a field, grind corn, or whisper a prayer to the wind. The homes and hearths of Cahokia. Imagine waking up in a small, earthen house near the base of Monk's Mound. The walls are made from vertical saplings packed with mud and straw, what archaeologists call wattle and daub. Smoke curls upward from a small central hearth, and the cool morning air presses through the gaps in the thatch roof. A family of 5 or 6 lives here, Parents, children, perhaps a grandparent or two. There's no privacy in the modern sense. No doors with locks, just shared space, quiet routines, and long memories. Clothing is made from animal hides, woven fibers and feathers. Tools hang on the walls, stone knives, bone awls, wooden ladles. Food is stored in clay jars tucked into the corners. Outside, neighbors are already at work repairing fences, gathering firewood, feeding domesticated dogs, which served both as companions and work animals. Chickens, pigs, and cows won't arrive in North America until Europeans bring them centuries later. Instead, Cahokians relied on fishing, hunting deer and small game, and the genius of agriculture. A people of fields and forests. The agricultural fields surrounding Cahokia stretch for miles in all directions. These were not endless monocultures, but carefully managed patches of corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and goosefoot. The soil was worked with digging sticks and stone tools, no plows, no beasts of burden. Women likely controlled much of the planting and harvesting. Farming was communal, cyclical, and sacred. The first green shoots of corn were not just food, but signs of life's balance. Beans climbing the corn stalks meant the world was working as it should. In fall, harvest festivals may have filled the plazas. People danced, feasted, and thanked the spirits. Cornmeal was ground on stone metates, mixed with water and cooked into thick gruel or flatbreads. Seeds were stored in clay jars or woven baskets, hidden from rodents, saved for spring. Foraging added to the diet: hickory nuts, blackberries, wild onions. Fishing weirs in nearby streams caught catfish and gar. Hunting parties returned with deer or rabbits, but by 1300, signs of overhunting appear, an early warning of ecological strain. Trade without money. Cahokia's economy functioned without coins, banks, or even writing. Instead, trade was driven by social obligation, memory, and ceremony. You gave what you had, and you received what others had to offer. This didn't mean it was simple, it meant it required trust. Shell beads from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, and chert from Illinois all found their way into Cahokia's markets. A single carved shell gorget might represent weeks of labor and years of symbolism. Items weren't just practical, they were woven with meaning. And then there was salt. Cahokia was near one of the few reliable inland salt sources east of the Mississippi. Salt was life, for preserving food, curing hides, and ceremonial uses. It may have been Cahokia's most valuable export. Goods moved along rivers and trails in woven packs, often carried by foot. Every object held the fingerprints of many people: the hunter, the carver, the traveler, the trader. The sounds of ceremony. Not every day in Cahokia was ordinary. Some were filled with ritual, loud, colorful, and collective. The great plaza before Monk's Mound was likely the stage for large gatherings. Perhaps thousands came to watch processions of masked dancers or hear the drumbeat of the longhouse ceremonies. Religious leaders may have worn elaborate regalia made from feathers, shells, and painted fabrics. Smoke from cedar and tobacco filled the air. Drums pounded rhythmically, voices chanted stories passed down for generations. No written records remain, but oral tradition carried everything. The stories of origin, the boundaries of the spirit world, the obligations of kin. Ritual and politics were inseparable. Leaders derived power from their connection to the cosmos. They were the ones who read the stars, who knew when to plant, and who conducted the ceremonies that kept the world turning. The hierarchy beneath the surface. Beneath the apparent harmony of Cahokia's community life was a deeply stratified society. The ruling elite, perhaps a priest-king and his family, lived atop the largest mounds, above the plaza, both physically and symbolically elevated. Their homes were larger, their clothing finer, their burials richer. Around them clustered advisors, craftspeople, and religious specialists. Farther out in neighborhoods and hamlets lived farmers, hunters, and laborers. Some were buried simply, others with tools or pottery. The difference in burial goods speaks volumes about social inequality. Some graves held nothing. Others held copper axes, bird-shaped pendants, and exotic stones. There's no sign of prisons or written laws. Social order was likely maintained through kinship networks, religious obligation, and shared beliefs. But if there were dissenters, their stories remain unspoken. Children of the mound. Children in Cahokia were not idle. From a young age, they learned to carry water, tend fires, fetch wood, and help in fields. Boys might be trained in hunting, fishing, or crafting. Girls learned to cook, weave, and plant. There was no school as we know it. Learning was apprenticeship, story, repetition. Toys have been found in archaeological digs. Small clay figures, miniature tools, carved bones. These are rare windows into the emotional life of a society that left no books, no letters, no drawings. Illness was a constant threat. Without metal tools or formal medicine, people relied on herbal remedies, sweat lodges, and the guidance of healers. Life expectancy was shorter. Childhood diseases, injuries, and infections often proved fatal. Yet life went on. Rituals welcomed new life and mourned death, just as we do now. The edges of decline. By the 1300s, something had begun to shift. Environmental changes may have reduced crop yields. The region shows evidence of floods and droughts, both deadly in a society tied to river and soil. Forests near the city had been stripped for wood to build homes and fuel fires. Game grew scarce. The complexity that once bound Cahokia together may have started to strain. As population declined, some neighborhoods were abandoned. The plazas fell quiet more often. The elites lost their grip. The great ceremonies occurred less frequently. But there's no evidence of invasion or destruction. No charred buildings, no mass graves. The end came not with a bang, but with footsteps, people walking away, returning to older ways, scattering into the forests from which their ancestors had come. And so Cahokia passed into silence. A pause in the story. We know so much about Cahokia and yet so little. Its grandeur is undeniable, its purpose still debated, its legacy mostly erased. And so we ask, as the last fires went out on the great mound, and the wood of Woodhenge rotted in the ground, what memories did the final generation carry with them? What stories did they whisper, knowing the city was dying? By the time Europeans first sailed the rivers near present-day St. Louis, the great city of Cahokia was gone, its plazas quiet, its temples decayed, and its people scattered into memory. Yet the mounds remained. Covered in grass and forest, mistaken for natural hills, they sat silent, hiding the story of an American city that had once rivaled London in size. This final section traces what became of Cahokia after its decline, how it was forgotten, what archaeology has uncovered, and why its quiet lessons still echo through the soil of the Mississippi Valley. The long silence. By 1400 CE, Cahokia was nearly empty. We know this not from journals or oral tales passed down across generations, but from the archaeological record, layers of debris thinning, building activity halting, and burials becoming rare. Cahokia's central structures were no longer maintained. The wooden buildings had collapsed. The great mound stood unused. No violent conquest marked the end. No disease that we can trace. The city's fall was gradual, the causes complex. Environmental changes, political unrest, religious disillusionment, perhaps all of these played a role. Some people likely migrated south and east, joining or forming new communities. Others may have returned to smaller, self-sufficient villages. Their descendants would later be known as the Osage, the Mandan, the Illinois, and other tribes, some of whom claimed the mounds were built by giants, spirits, or ancient peoples long gone. The truth had already begun to fade from memory. Europeans and the inheritance of forgetting. When Hernando de Soto crossed the Mississippi in 1541, nearly a century and a half after Cahokia's fall, he encountered scattered villages, maize fields, and dense forests. The cities of the Mississippians were no more. Even the concept of a large, centralized settlement in the interior of North America had become unimaginable. Later French explorers in the 1600s passed by the mounds and marveled at their size, but they never understood what they had been. The people they met had no stories to explain them. Oral traditions had drifted, and the ceremonial links to Cahokia had broken. By the 1800s, American settlers farming the land referred to the largest mound as Monk's Mound, named for French Trappist monks who briefly lived nearby. They flattened smaller mounds for farming, dug into others out of curiosity, and planted trees along the ridges. The city became farmland. The earth covered history. The narrative of North America as an empty wilderness suited European colonization. The idea that a large city had once stood on this land challenged that myth and was quietly ignored. Rediscovery in the dirt. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a few archaeologists began to pay attention. Their methods were crude by modern standards, often digging with shovels and little documentation, but they began to uncover artifacts that hinted at a deeper story. As modern archaeology improved, Cahokia was reevaluated. Excavations revealed layers of houses, trash pits, pottery fragments, burial mounds, and trade goods. Radiocarbon dating, aerial photography, and soil analysis confirmed what the artifacts suggested. Cahokia had been a major urban center. Thousands of post holes showed where homes had stood. Charred seeds revealed the agricultural methods. Cut and polished bones suggested craft specialization. And beneath one mound, they found the remains of more than 250 individuals, many of them young women, possibly sacrificed in ritual. Others were buried with care and treasure. Hierarchies, rituals, economies, all buried beneath 1,000 years of dirt. In the 1960s and 70s, the urgency grew. Highways and housing developments threatened to erase the site permanently. Preservationists fought back. Cahokia Mounds was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, the only pre-Columbian city in the U.S. to hold that distinction. The puzzle of Woodhenge and the sky. One of the most fascinating discoveries came in the 1960s, post holes in circular patterns northwest of Monk's Mound. Archaeologists reconstructed what became known as Woodhenge, a timber circle of massive red cedar posts, carefully aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. At sunrise on the winter solstice, the sun would rise directly over Monk's Mound when viewed from the center of the circle. This wasn't coincidence. It was astronomy made of earth and wood, a sign that Cahokia's people tracked the heavens as carefully as any European court astrologer. Even in a society without metal tools or telescopes, they had mapped the stars, charted the seasons, and tied their ceremonies to cosmic rhythms. The mounds and the skis were in conversation. It was a sacred geometry few imagined existed in ancient North America. Symbols and spirits, Cahokia's religion. What did the people of Cahokia believe? They left no books, but their symbols speak. Engraved on shell, painted on pottery, and carved into stone, these images repeat across the Mississippian world. The falcon, or birdman, was a powerful motif, half man, half bird, sometimes clutching weapons, wings outstretched. He may have represented a sky deity, a warrior ancestor, or a ruler imbued with cosmic power. Burials near the Birdman Mound are rich with symbolism. Copper plates shaped like wings, weapons laid beside bodies, and geometric patterns surrounding them. Other symbols include cross and circle designs, representing the four cardinal directions and the sacred center. The hand and eye motif may signal spiritual vision. Animals, rattlesnakes, panthers, turtles suggested connections to different realms, above, below, and the middle world of the living. It was a spiritual world. Both practical and cosmic rulers drew power from the heavens, but they also had to ensure good harvests. Religion, science, and politics were one. the city without a name. We call it Cahokia, but that name is borrowed from a later group of Illinois people who lived in the area during the 17th century. They had no connection to the original builders. We don't know what the people of Cahokia called themselves. Their language is unknown. No writing survives. Even their word for city, if they had one, is lost. This makes Cahokia unique. It is a civilization we know mostly through its debris: post holes, broken pottery, burned corn, copper trinkets, human remains. Their greatest monument was made of earth, not stone, and yet it has outlasted nations. There is no Rosetta Stone for Cahokia, just the mounds, the soil, and our desire to understand. Lessons in fragility. Cahokia's rise and fall holds lessons that feel quietly familiar. They built a society around agriculture, trade, and ceremony. They created a hierarchy that unified thousands, controlled resources, and expressed cosmic order. But as their population grew, so did their impact: deforestation, soil exhaustion, changing rivers. Their world was finely balanced, and when climate or politics shifted, that balance was lost. They left no monuments to conquest, no cathedrals of stone, but they raised massive mounds, aligned the heavens to the earth, and kept memory alive through ritual. In time, though, memory faded. The city dissolved not with blood but with silence. The final reflection. Today, Monk's Mound still stands, overlooking highways, gas stations, and neighborhoods. Few who pass by realize they're near what was once the heart of a lost American city. And so the question remains: what would it mean if we remembered Cahokia not just as a curiosity, but as part of our shared history, a city that stood before Columbus ever sailed, built by people with no written language, no metal tools, but a clear understanding of how to build, farm, trade, and believe? What would it mean to no longer ask if North America had civilizations before 1492, but to ask instead why we forgot them? Story 2. Fish weirs and birch bark, life among the Algonquin peoples. Long before maps drew boundaries, before flags were planted and treaties broken, there were rivers. Thousands of them. Clear, winding, cold in spring, low in late summer. They carved through thick forests, cut across granite ridges, and served as both roads and boundaries for the people who lived there. To understand the Algonquin-speaking peoples before Columbus arrived is to understand the geography of a world defined not by stone cities or towering pyramids, but by birch canoes, fish weirs, winter camps, and sacred stories carried in the breath of elders. This is not a history of empires. It is a history of movement, memory, and quiet resilience of people who adapted to the rhythm of northern seasons and left their legacy not in ruins, but in living forests and flowing rivers. Who were the Algonquins? The term Algonquin can be confusing. It refers both to a specific group, the Algonquin people living in what is now eastern Ontario and western Quebec, and more broadly to a vast family of tribes who spoke related Algonquian languages. These included the Ojibwe, Cree, Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, and many more stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the woodlands of the Great Lakes and beyond. Before 1492, these communities thrived in one of the most ecologically rich and seasonally demanding regions of North America. They lived in small, mobile groups tied to family networks. Their survival didn't depend on grand cities, but on intimate knowledge of land, animal patterns, seasonal cycles, and how to live lightly on a landscape that could be both generous and punishing. The landscape they called home. From the pine-covered shores of Lake Huron to the tidal inlets of Nova Scotia, Algonquian peoples lived in diverse environments, but most shared a similar ecological reality: long winters, short growing seasons, dense forests, and countless lakes and rivers. Summers were brief but rich: berries, fish, migratory birds, green plants. Winters were long, cold, and isolating. In between were the crucial seasons of harvest and movement. Rather than settle in permanent towns, Most Algonquian peoples moved seasonally. Summer villages near rivers allowed for fishing, trade, and social gatherings. Winter camps, smaller and more dispersed, were located deeper in forests, sheltered from wind, near hunting grounds and wood fuel. These weren't aimless wanderings. Every route, every lake, every ridge had a name, a story, a purpose. Land was not owned, but deeply known. The birch bark canoe, technology and simplicity. It is difficult to overstate the importance of the birch bark canoe. Light, durable, and easily repairable, these vessels were engineered to navigate both wide rivers and narrow portage trails. A good canoe could carry hundreds of pounds of supplies or passengers, yet be hoisted by a single person when necessary. Made from the bark of white birch trees, sewn with spruce roots, sealed with pine resin, and framed with cedar ribs, each canoe was a masterpiece of environmental knowledge. Every material was gathered with ceremony and care. Tools included stone scrapers, bone awls, and wooden wedges. With these canoes, Algonquian peoples traveled hundreds of miles for trade, fishing, marriage, or diplomacy. Rivers were highways, lakes were crossroads. In a world where travel over land was slow and difficult, the canoe made the forest open. Fish weirs and seasonal abundance. In spring, when ice broke and rivers swelled with meltwater, fish began to migrate upstream to spawn. The Algonquins, like many indigenous groups, had developed a highly effective and sustainable technology: fish weirs. These were V-shaped fences or walls made of woven wood, stone, or brush, built across rivers to funnel fish into narrow areas where they could be easily speared or netted. Weirs were often communal, with large hauls distributed among families or dried for storage. Salmon, sturgeon, eel, and trout were especially important. Smoked or dried fish could last for months, a crucial food source through the winter. Fish bones and oil were used too. Nothing was wasted. Nearby, women would set up seasonal camps. Bark shelters were built, fires lit, and fish processed while children played and elders told stories. These camps became important social centers, places for teaching, trade, and ceremony. The rhythm of the fish run dictated the rhythm of life. Food without fields. Unlike the Mississippians to the south, most Algonquian peoples were not heavy agriculturalists. The short northern growing season and thin soils made large-scale farming difficult. Instead, they developed a highly adaptive seasonal economy. Spring, ice melt brought fish, maple sap for syrup, and the reawakening of forests. Summer, berries, roots, edible greens, and freshwater mussels were gathered. Some small gardens of corn or squash were tended in southern regions. Fall, nuts, especially acorns and hickory nuts, were collected. Hunting focused on deer and bear. Winter, families lived in smaller groups, hunting moose, beaver, and snowshoe hare. Snowshoes and toboggans made winter travel possible. This economy required constant movement and deep knowledge. It wasn't inefficient, it was intelligent. It responded to nature rather than trying to reshape it. Shelters and clothing. Seasonal mobility meant shelters had to be portable, adaptable, and quick to build. In summer, the wigwam, a domed structure made of saplings, bark, and hides, was common. In winter, larger bark-covered lodges insulated with snow or moss helped retain heat. Fires burned at the center, smoke escaping through vents. Clothing was made from animal hides: deer, moose, or beaver, softened with fat, chewed into suppleness, and sewn with sinew. In cold weather, people layered furs and cloaks. In warm seasons, clothing was minimal and practical. Decoration was not absent. Beads made from bone or shell, dyed porcupine quills, and intricate stitching gave identity and meaning to even the most basic garments. Each pattern could signify family, region, or personal achievement. Language, stories, and the spirit world. In a world without writing, memory was sacred. Algonquian languages are rich in verbs in motion, and in metaphors drawn from the natural world. They are flexible, descriptive, and intimately tied to the land. Elders served as libraries. They held the myths, origin stories, practical knowledge, and seasonal wisdom that guided life. Children learned by listening, watching, and repeating. Every story had layers, entertainment, morality, and instruction all in one. Spiritual belief was animist. Everything had a spirit: rocks, rivers, animals, even weather. Dreams and visions were sources of power and direction. Shamans or medicine people helped interpret signs, treat illness, and guide decisions. Ceremonies included dances, songs, offerings of tobacco, and purification rituals. Sacred places, springs, cliffs, islands were honored quietly. There were no temples. The land itself was holy. Family and community. The basic social unit was the extended family or band, a flexible group of relatives who hunted, traveled, and lived together. Decisions were made by consensus. Leadership was based on respect and experience, not wealth or coercion. Kinship systems were complex and differed between groups. Some were patrilineal, others matrilineal. Marriage alliances strengthened social ties across distances. Trade and diplomacy were conducted through elaborate rituals of gift-giving and speech-making. Justice was restorative, not punitive. A crime was a wound in the social fabric. Healing rather than punishment was the goal. Compensation, apology, and ritual often restored balance. In such small, tight-knit communities, reputation mattered more than law. A culture misunderstood. When Europeans eventually arrived in the 1500s and 1600s, they often misunderstood what they saw. They interpreted mobility as aimlessness, oral tradition as ignorance, and small shelters as signs of poverty. But this was a different way of being, a culture not based on permanence but adaptation, not on ownership but relationship, not on written law but remembered wisdom. They didn't build monuments to be remembered. They lived in ways that didn't need to be. The open question. So as we float down the rivers of memory and imagine a summer camp along a bend in the Ottawa River, smoke curling from a wigwam, fish drying in the sun, a canoe being patched with resin, we might ask, what does it mean to live in a way that leaves so little behind, and yet everything in balance? If Section 1 introduced the rivers, forests, and lifeways of the Algonquin peoples before European contact, then Section 2 explores what sustained that way of life, not just food and tools, but relationships, rituals, and memory. This is a story of time marked by snow and thaw, by migration and gathering, by knowledge passed down around campfires. In this section, we descend deeper into the rhythms of a culture shaped not by stone, but by silence and return. Living by the seasons. To live in the northeastern woodlands before colonization was to be in constant conversation with the seasons. The year was not divided into months on a calendar, but into natural phases: when the rivers thawed, when the berries ripened, when the snow crusted hard enough to carry a hunter's weight. The Algonquin year followed a seasonal round, a cycle of migration between known campsites and resource zones. Spring, as snow melted and rivers swelled, families traveled to maple groves to tap trees for sap. This syrup was one of the earliest sources of sugar. Streams came alive with fish suckers, smelt, and salmon moving upstream, triggering the building of weirs and the reopening of fish camps. Repairs were made to canoes, clothing, and tools. Summer, larger groups gathered near lakes and rivers. These were times for trade, socializing, marriage arrangements, and communal storytelling. Berries and herbs were gathered. Sometimes, gardens of corn, beans, and squash were planted where conditions allowed, especially in more southern regions like Abenaki or Nipmuc territory. Games and ceremonies filled long days. Fall, nuts were collected, especially acorns and butternuts. Hunting intensified. Smokehouses were set up to preserve meat. Canoes were patched, snowshoes repaired, and supplies organized. This was the most crucial season for preparation. Winter, snow-covered forests became quiet. Family groups moved into deeper woods where they relied on caches of food, hunting small game and fishing through ice. Snowshoes allowed travel, toboggans carried supplies. The pace of life slowed. Nights were long, stories grew longer. To survive required not only physical resilience but knowledge, knowing when to move, what to bring, and how to read subtle signs of change. There were no clocks. The sky, trees, and rivers told the time. Community, kinship, and roles. Algonquian societies were built on kinship and reciprocity, not institutions. Your role was defined not by your wealth but by your age, experience, and family connections. Every person had a place in the social fabric. Elders held memory. They were advisors, healers, and historians. Their authority came from wisdom, not force. A respected elder might guide decisions for a band, but consensus was key. Leadership was gentle, and decisions were slow. Men often took on roles in hunting, fishing, and long-distance travel. They carved tools, built shelters, negotiated with neighboring groups, and led rituals requiring fasting or isolation. Their skills were passed from father to son, uncle to nephew. Women were the managers of camp life. They processed food, made clothing, wove mats, and carried vast knowledge of plants. In some communities, like the Mi'kmaq or Maliseet, women had powerful roles in diplomacy and decision-making. Lineages could be matrilineal, and property like canoes or tools was often controlled through the mother's line. Children were apprentices. From toddlerhood, they were given miniature tools and real responsibilities. They learned by doing, helping to clean fish, patch shelters, carry water. Childhood was not idle, but full of initiation into the tasks that sustained life. Marriage was not just a union of individuals but of families, sometimes even between distant groups, solidifying trade alliances and peace. Ceremonies were modest, gifts exchanged, feasts shared, songs sung. Divorce was accepted and handled quietly. There were no prisons, no courts. When someone broke a social code, the group responded with dialogue, gift-giving, or exile. Justice was not about punishment, it was about restoring harmony. Trade, diplomacy, and the gift economy. Far from being isolated, Algonquian communities were part of vast networks of trade and diplomacy stretching across the continent. A canoe traveling down the St. Lawrence might carry smoked fish, antler tools, or birch bark containers. From other groups, they might receive copper from Lake Superior, chert from Vermont, or shells from the Atlantic. Trade wasn't just about materials, it was about relationships. Every gift implied a return. Social status could be built not by hoarding but by generosity. The more one gave, the more one demonstrated power and honor. Meetings between groups were governed by ritual language and symbolic offerings. Tobacco, sweetgrass, and beads played essential roles. Pipes were shared in ceremony. Words were chosen with care, spoken in metaphor, often repeated by elders to ensure understanding. Even war, when it occurred, was ritualized. Raids were quick and targeted. Revenge cycles were managed through diplomacy. Captives could be adopted or traded. Balance mattered more than victory. Sacred landscapes in the spirit world. The land itself was alive. Rocks, rivers, winds, and animals all had spirits. Some were helpful, others dangerous, all deserving of respect. Trees were not chopped carelessly. Animals killed in hunting were thanked through ritual. Dreams held power. A dream might be a message from the spirits, a guide to the right hunting ground, or a warning of illness. Shamans helped interpret these dreams and heal the body and soul. Ceremony was woven into everyday life. Offerings of tobacco might be left at a river's edge. A new canoe might be fed with smoke before launch. Births, deaths, first hunts, and seasonal changes all required ritual. Sacred places, caves, islands, waterfalls were visited only with proper preparation. Some locations, like Odanak or Manitoulin Island, became centers of pilgrimage. There were no temples, but there was reverence. The forest was a church with no walls. Tools and technologies of the forest. Though they lacked metal tools, Algonquian peoples were not primitive. Their technologies were deeply suited to their environment. Stone tools, carefully chipped arrowheads, scrapers, and axes from flint, chert, or quartzite. Some were small and precise, others used for felling trees or butchering moose. Bone and antler, awls, needles, fishhooks, and handles carved with incredible skill. Deer bones became sled runners. Moose antlers became chisels. Cordage and baskets, made from plant fibers like basswood or spruce roots. Coiled baskets, burden straps, snowshoe laces. Strong, flexible, and water-resistant. Cooking, food was boiled in bark containers using hot stones or roasted on open fires. Clay pottery was used in some regions, though fragile. Smoking and drying were key to preserving food. Snowshoes and toboggans, essential in winter. Frames of bent wood laced with hide allowed travel over deep snow. Toboggans hauled game or supplies across frozen lakes. These tools weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Engraved, dyed, adorned with beads or quills. Each object told a story. The challenge of memory. Much of what we know about these people comes not from their own records, but from archaeological findings and early European observations, some thoughtful, others riddled with misunderstanding. Missionaries recorded daily life in journals. Fur traders wrote of alliances and winter camps. Anthropologists collected oral histories in the 19th and 20th centuries. But by then, centuries of disease, displacement, and colonization had already taken their toll. Much of Algonquian history exists in fragments, tools in museums, stories recorded in translation, traditions preserved by indigenous elders working to revive language and ceremony. We know more than we did, but not all. Some knowledge is private, protected, or forgotten. And still the forest stands. Despite centuries of upheaval, many Algonquian-speaking peoples endure. The Abenaki, Cree, Innu, Mi'kmaq, Algonquin, and others. Their languages are still spoken. Canoes are still carved. Stories are still told. The rivers still flow. The question that remains: as we imagine a winter night around a campfire deep in the Laurentian woods, snow piled against the lodge, a pot of broth steaming, an elder beginning a story with, "Long ago, when the world was young," we are left with a question. What have we forgotten, not because it was erased, but because we stopped listening? By now, we've walked the seasonal trails, sat beside fish weirs in spring, drifted in birch canoes on summer lakes, and crouched inside winter lodges, listening to the breath of the forest. We've seen how the Algonquin-speaking peoples shaped their world not through monuments of stone, but through memory, migration, and an intimacy with land that resisted permanence. But nothing, not even the cycles of forest and snow, is immune to change. In this final section, we trace how the lives of these peoples were irrevocably altered after European contact, and yet, how some roots remain deep, hidden beneath the surface, waiting. First contact, arrival without warning. When the first Europeans arrived on the eastern shores of North America in the late 1400s and early 1500s, they came not with armies but with ships, and with them, invisible threads of upheaval. The earliest encounters between Algonquian-speaking peoples and Europeans were quiet, tentative, and often based on mutual curiosity. Mi'kmaq and Maliseet traders met Basque fishermen off Newfoundland. Stories were exchanged. Beads were traded for furs. Sailors marveled at the finely made canoes and warm fur cloaks of the local people. But beneath the surface of these first exchanges lay something far more destructive: disease. Even before large-scale colonization, diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles began to spread inland, carried unknowingly by traders, goods, or displaced peoples. Communities with no immunity suffered horrifying losses. Oral accounts speak of entire villages vanishing in a season. The silence that followed was not just physical, it was cultural. Elders died, stories were lost, memory broke. The fur trade and shifting economies. As European powers gained interest in the continent, they saw its forests not as homes to indigenous peoples, but as vast stores of wealth, particularly in fur. Beaver pelts, prized in Europe for hat-making, became the currency of a booming trade. Algonquian groups were drawn into this new economy. A trapper could trade dozens of pelts for iron tools, firearms, or textiles. Old alliances frayed, new ones were forged. The fur trade transformed traditional life. Seasonal movements changed to follow trade routes. Some groups moved westward to find untouched fur-bearing lands. Young men spent longer away from families. Dependency on European goods grew. It wasn't an equal exchange. Alcohol, introduced by traders, devastated many communities. Guns altered power dynamics, and always more disease. But it was also a time of adaptation. New trade languages emerged. Canoe designs shifted. Stories evolved to reflect the newcomers. Some leaders rose to prominence not by hunting or healing, but by navigating the new trade relationships. Still, the forests began to feel smaller. The rivers were no longer just highways between family camps, they were now corridors of competition. Missions, conversion, and resistance. By the 1600s, Jesuit missionaries arrived in force. Their goal was not trade but conversion. They built missions among the Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, Algonquin, and others. They studied languages, wrote grammars, and baptized hundreds. But they also labeled traditional beliefs as superstition. Ceremonies were suppressed. Medicine people were mocked or persecuted. Sacred objects were burned. Some indigenous people adopted the new religion sometimes out of belief, sometimes out of necessity. A Christian name could offer protection. A baptism might shield a child from being taken during a raid or resettlement. Others resisted quietly. They listened but didn't believe. They practiced old ceremonies at night. They hid sacred bundles. Oral traditions were wrapped in Christian metaphor to avoid punishment. Culture bent but did not fully break. Displacement and the breaking of trails. With colonization came displacement. In New England and New France, conflicts like the Beaver Wars, King Philip's War, and the French and Indian Wars pushed Algonquian-speaking peoples from their ancestral lands. Survivors fled north and west, some into Canada, others joining neighboring tribes. Villages became mission towns. Campgrounds became reservations. The seasonal round was broken by imposed borders and forced agriculture. Children were taken to boarding schools. Languages were forbidden. The old life, the fish weirs, the birch canoes, the winter lodges faded. Some were preserved in stories. Others simply vanished, unrecorded, unremembered. By the 1800s, many outsiders believed the forest Indians had disappeared. They hadn't. Survivance, memory beneath the snow. In the 20th and 21st centuries, indigenous scholars introduced a new term, survivance. Not just survival, but presence, resistance, the quiet continuation of culture in the face of erasure. Among Algonquian-speaking peoples today, that survivance is everywhere. Elders teaching Ojibwe or Mi'kmaq in community centers and immersion schools. Canoe builders harvesting birch with prayers, just as their ancestors did. Storytellers recording origin tales, once whispered beside winter fires. Activists protecting ancestral lands from pipelines and deforestation. Artists embedding traditional designs in beadwork, tattoos, and street murals. Even the old fish weirs have found new life in archaeological sites, environmental projects, and educational programs. Communities are remembering what their great-grandparents were forced to forget. The trail is not gone, it was just overgrown. Lessons in lightness. It's easy to overlook the Algonquian world before 1492 because it left so few visible marks. No pyramids, no cities, no books. But this wasn't because of ignorance, it was by design. These peoples lived lightly on the land because they understood its cycles. They didn't overbuild because they didn't overstay. They remembered instead of recording. They adapted instead of conquering. Their resilience came not from rigidity but from flexibility. When snow covered the ground, they didn't curse the season. They moved to the winter camp, unpacked their snowshoes, and told stories until spring. What could be more intelligent than that? The final reflection. Today, if you paddle quietly down a wooded river in Quebec or northern Maine, you may pass over ancient trails used for thousands of years. You may camp beside a bend where fish were once dried in the sun. You may sit by a fire and hear the wind move through the trees like breath, like memory. And you might wonder, if a culture can survive without stone or steel, but only in the hearts and habits of its people, does that make it more fragile or more enduring? Story 3. The Pueblo Builders, Stones, Stars, and Survival in the Southwest. In the arid, wind-shaped canyons of the American Southwest, time moves differently. A day might pass in stillness. A century might leave behind only the fading trace of a handprint on sandstone. Yet here, centuries before Columbus landed in the Caribbean, entire communities carved lives into cliff faces and dry mesas. They raised stone villages, mapped the stars, and harvested corn where rainfall was more memory than certainty. These were the ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning ancient ones, or enemies of the ancestors. The descendants of these people live today as the Hopi, Zuni, Taos, Acoma, and other Pueblo communities. But before those names were spoken, before those languages shaped the world, their ancestors were already building stone dwellings that rose like stairways against canyon walls. This is not a story of migration or hunting. It's a story of construction, observation, patience, and how a people learned to make permanence out of stone and sky. The land of little rain. The Four Corners region where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet is one of the most geologically dramatic and ecologically challenging environments in North America. Hot summers, freezing winters, sparse rainfall, long droughts, flash floods, erosion. And yet, for over 1,000 years before European contact, people lived here not just as wanderers but as architects. The ancestral Pueblones adapted not by fleeing the desert but by learning its logic. They chose homes in places that defied expectation, under stone cliffs, atop mesas, deep within canyons. They designed systems to collect rain, track time, and preserve food in silence. And most remarkably, they built multi-story dwellings from stone and adobe, a feat unmatched north of Mexico at the time. From pit houses to palaces of stone. Around 1000 BCE, the earliest ancestors of the Pueblo peoples lived in pit houses, semi-subterranean dwellings dug into the earth and roofed with wooden beams, mud, and brush. These were efficient, cool in summer, warm in winter. Early settlements clustered along riverbanks and seasonal streams, where crops could grow. By 500 CE, these homes evolved. Walls were added above ground. Villages became more permanent. Kivas, ceremonial circular rooms dug into the ground, became central to communal life. Then, beginning around 750 CE, and continuing for over 500 years, a wave of architectural innovation swept through the Southwest. In places like Chaco Canyon, massive stone great houses were built, some with hundreds of rooms, rising 3 or 4 stories high, laid out with precise astronomical alignment. In Mesa Verde, families built stone dwellings beneath protective cliff overhangs, some only accessible by ladders or carved handholds in the rock. In Bandelier and Canyon de Chelly, cave walls were hollowed out into rooms. Ladders led to rooftop entrances. Adobe bricks held together with straw and sweat created smooth, curved surfaces that still stand today. This was a civilization of engineers not with steel or cranes, but with stone tools, time, and a deep understanding of place. Dry farming and sacred water. How do you farm in a desert? The ancestral Puebloans mastered a form of dry farming, where every drop of water was precious. They built check dams, small rock barriers to slow and spread rainwater runoff. They dug shallow waffle gardens, grid-like depressions in the soil to trap moisture and protect plants from wind. Crops were planted not in rows, but in small clusters, sheltered by rocks and mulch. Their main crops were the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash, along with sunflowers, amaranth, and wild greens. Corn was more than food, it was spiritual. Each variety held ceremonial significance, and some are still planted today in Hopi villages using dry farming methods passed down through the centuries. They also stored food in sealed jars and stone granaries, hidden in cliffs or protected inside rooms with ventilated walls. A single successful harvest might feed a family for a year or longer. Rain itself was sacred. Cloudbursts were celebrated. Water was gathered not just from rivers but from seeps, rock pools, and snowmelt. A pot of water was not a convenience, it was a blessing. Life in the cliff dwellings. By the late 1100s, many ancestral Puebloan communities moved into cliff dwellings, iconic stone villages built under natural rock alcoves. The reasons for this shift are debated. Defense, climate change, resource scarcity. Whatever the cause, the result was stunning. Take Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde. Over 150 rooms and 23 kivas tucked into a natural overhang. Builders shaped sandstone blocks with stone hammers, fitted them with mortar made from ash, clay, and water, and painted them with pigments. Roof beams of juniper or pine were carried up from the canyon floor. Inside, families cooked with metates, grinding stones used to crush maize into meal. Pottery was fired in open-air kilns, decorated with black-on-white designs or corrugated patterns. Fires burned in hearths, their smoke escaping through roof holes. Light played across the stone at different angles throughout the day. At night, stars shone bright in a sky with no modern light to dim them. Children climbed ladders like staircases. Women tended fires and crops. Men hunted rabbits and deer, and gathered with others in the kiva's circular rooms thought to represent the Sipapu, the mythic place of emergence from the underworld. Kivas, windows to the sacred. At the heart of Puebloan ceremonial life was the kiva, a round, often subterranean structure used for ritual, teaching, and counsel. Each kiva had a Sipapu, a small hole in the floor, symbolizing the connection between the world of the living and the spiritual underworld. The kiva wasn't just a meeting room, it was a miniature cosmos. The roof opening represented the sky. The fire pit represented the sun. The walls represented the four cardinal directions. The Sipapu was the womb of the earth. Ceremonies in the kiva were not public spectacles. They were communal acts of renewal. Songs, dances, chants all offered to maintain harmony with nature and with the ancestors. In some communities, secret societies maintained knowledge of rituals passed down only through initiation. Kivas were entered by ladders. The descent was symbolic, returning to the source before rising again. Even today, in modern Pueblo ceremonies, this symbolism persists. Time told by shadows. Perhaps the most extraordinary achievement of the ancestral Puebloans was not their architecture, but their astronomy. At Fajada Butte in Chaco Canyon, 3 stone slabs lean against a rock wall. Behind them, a carved spiral marks the seasons. On the summer solstice, a narrow beam of sunlight, the sun dagger, passes directly through the stones to slice the spiral in two. On the winter solstice, it shifts position, marking time with perfect precision. This was not accident. This was observation, geometry, and ritual woven together. Other buildings in Chaco and beyond align with solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills. Light and shadow were used to mark planting time, harvest, and ceremonial days. In a landscape without written calendars, the sun told time. The walls remembered it. The beginning of an ending. By the late 1200s, something began to change. Great houses were abandoned. Cliff dwellings were vacated. Kivas were sealed. Over several generations, the ancestral pueblones moved. Why? Theories abound. A megadrought confirmed by tree ring data may have made farming unsustainable. Resource exhaustion would. Game, fertile soil may have pushed people to leave. Social conflict, perhaps over religion or leadership, may have fractured communities. Spiritual reasons, a need to move toward new sacred lands, are cited in Hopi and Zuni traditions. There is no evidence of war or catastrophe, no mass graves, no sudden collapse, instead a slow, deliberate departure, a migration that was not an ending but a transformation. The open-ended past. What's remarkable is that the Pueblo peoples of today still carry the stories, rituals, and agricultural knowledge of those who built Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. They do not speak of a lost civilization, but of a journey. To the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Taos, those stone ruins are not relics, they are footprints. And so we end this first section not with disappearance, but with continuity. And we ask, what does it mean when a people leave behind stone cities? Not because they failed, but because they chose to continue elsewhere, carrying their identity not in walls, but in memory. In Section 1, we climbed the cliffside homes, descended into sacred kivas, and followed the ancestral pueblones through the rhythms of survival. We now turn to something larger: Chaco Canyon, the cultural and ceremonial heart of the ancient Pueblo world. Here, amid a wide, wind-burnished desert, a mysterious city of stone and geometry rose, precise, planned, and still not fully understood. Section 2 explores the rise of Chacan society, its architectural feats, sacred roads, and wide influence across the Southwest. But it also traces the deepening mysteries of why the system unraveled and how a civilization that embraced complexity left it behind, quietly and deliberately. Chaco Canyon, a city made of silence. In the San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico lies Chaco Canyon, a desolate, dry expanse, flanked by sandstone cliffs and cut by an ephemeral stream. Today, it feels empty, unyielding. But 1,000 years ago, it was the center of a complex society, an urban hub unlike anything else in North America north of Mexico. Between 850 and 1150 CE, the Chacons constructed at least a dozen monumental great houses, massive, multi-story stone buildings with hundreds of rooms, long hallways, enclosed plazas, and elaborate kivas. The most famous, Pueblo Bonito, contained over 650 rooms and rose 4 stories high. These weren't just big buildings, they were aligned with precision to celestial events. Solstices, lunar cycles, cardinal directions. Every angle seemed to mean something. And remarkably, they were built in an environment with no nearby forests, minimal rainfall, and difficult access to water. This wasn't practicality. It was cosmology, a society built in stone to reflect the movements of the heavens. Building the unthinkable. The construction of Chaco's great houses was labor-intensive beyond comprehension. Sandstone was quarried from nearby cliffs. Timber, especially ponderosa pine and fir, was hauled in from as far as 50-70 miles away, one log at a time, without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools. Tens of thousands of beams were used for ceilings and floors. The walls, some over 3 feet thick, were carefully layered with stone and chinked with smaller pieces, forming a mosaic of texture and strength. Mortar made from sand, clay, and ash bound them together. This level of effort required central organization, a leadership structure, shared purpose, and perhaps religious mandate. Some scholars speculate that Chacoan society may have been a theocracy, ruled by a priestly class who used astronomical knowledge, ceremonial calendars, and labor organization to consolidate power. What we don't find are clear signs of kings, armies, or palaces. Chaco was powerful, but its power wasn't stamped in gold or conquest, it was woven into stone, shadow, and memory. The roads to Chaco. Chaco wasn't isolated. It was connected to dozens, possibly hundreds, of satellite communities across the Southwest. How do we know? Because they built roads. Over 400 miles of engineered roads radiate from Chaco Canyon, straight as arrows across mesas and valleys. Some are 30 feet wide, flanked by berms or retaining walls. They do not always follow the easiest path, they follow the cosmic one. These roads connected Chaco to outlier great houses like Aztec ruins, Salmon ruins, and Quinbainiola structures that mimic the design and alignment of Chaco's core. The roads may have been ceremonial, used in pilgrimages or processions. Some may have had practical trade functions, but above all, they symbolized order, a map of Chaco's spiritual gravity. Pottery, turquoise, obsidian, macaw feathers, and seashells all flowed into Chaco from hundreds of miles away. Goods moved along these invisible threads of stone and sand. Chaco was not just a place, it was an idea. Life in the shadow of the great houses. Not everyone lived inside the grand buildings. Most Chacons likely lived in smaller dwellings scattered around the canyon or on the periphery of great houses. These were built from adobe and stone, simpler but still organized. Daily life included farming, often done several miles from home. Cornfields were fed by check dams and runoff catchment systems. Every drop of rain was used. Crafting, including pottery production, stone toolmaking, and the creation of ornaments from shell and turquoise. Hunting and foraging, to supplement agricultural diets, though evidence suggests food security was never guaranteed. Ceremony, tied to the turning of seasons, cycles of the moon, and the planting and harvesting calendar. It was a society built on cooperation, likely structured through kinship, clan, and ceremonial affiliation. Labor for great house construction may have come from different communities, offering service during pilgrimage-like gatherings. Not everyone understood the cosmology, but everyone lived within its influence. The mystery of hierarchy and religion. Who led Chaco? The archaeological record gives few direct answers. There are no inscriptions, no thrones, no tombs filled with treasure, but there are patterns. In one room of Pueblo Bonito, archaeologists found the remains of more than a dozen individuals interred over generations, accompanied by elaborate grave goods, turquoise jewelry, finely made pottery, macaw remains, and rare minerals. DNA analysis suggests that these individuals were part of the same maternal lineage, passed down for centuries. Was this a ruling dynasty, a priestly bloodline, a sacred clan? We don't know. But the presence of macaws from the jungles of Mexico and cylinder jars resembling Mesoamerican cacao vessels suggest long-distance cultural exchange, possibly involving spiritual ideas, not just goods. Chaco may have been a center of ritual, a destination, a calendar, and a cosmology all in one. Signs of strain. And yet something shifted. By the late 1100s, the grandeur began to wane. Construction stopped. Trade slowed. Rooms were left empty. Some kivas were burned or ritually closed. Food shortages and evidence of nutritional stress appear in human remains. Tree-ring data shows a series of droughts in the 1100s and 1200s, severe and prolonged. Agricultural yields would have plummeted. As the environment changed, so too did trust in the religious or social systems that once bound Chaco together. Some outlying communities show signs of violence, defensive architecture, burned dwellings, skeletal trauma. Whether caused by resource scarcity, internal conflict, or external threats, the one-sorterly system frayed. People began to move, villages emptied, roads fell into dust. Chaco, once a city of order, became a shadow on the sandstone. Migration and continuity. But this was not collapse, it was movement. Communities that once aligned their lives with Chacan order began new chapters. They migrated south and east. They founded new pueblos, Acoma, Zuni, Taos, Hopi, places still inhabited today. They carried stories, ceremonial knowledge, and clan systems. They remembered the alignments, the kiva forms, the songs of planting and emergence. The memory of Chaco was not lost, it was transformed. In Hopi oral tradition, migration is central. The people are told to move when the time is right, to leave behind what is no longer in balance. When they reach a place that resonates with the heart, they build anew. The ruins of Chaco were not abandoned, they were completed. A world reorganized. In the centuries that followed, Pueblo societies restructured around villages, rather than vast ceremonial centers. These pueblos were more defensible, more sustainable, more attuned to their immediate environments. Each had its own ceremonial calendar, political autonomy, and distinctive language or dialect. But they shared architecture, agricultural practices, and a belief in harmony between people, place, and the cosmos. Pueblo society became resilient, able to weather droughts, Spanish colonization, missionization, and even forced relocation, all while maintaining ceremonial life. The great houses no longer rose, but the teachings remained. The question in the stone. Today, you can walk through the ruins of Chaco Canyon. You can stand in the shadow of Pueblo Bonito, touch the hand-hewn sandstone, and gaze down the line of a 1,000-year-old road that vanishes into the horizon. But no voice will answer your questions. So we ask, what does it mean when a society chooses to leave behind its grandest achievements not in failure, but in fidelity to its beliefs? And how many civilizations have we misunderstood because we mistook quiet departure for collapse? In the towering silence of Chaco's empty rooms, it would be easy to assume an ending. But for the descendants of the ancestral Pueblones, Chaco was not the final act, it was a chapter. The story of the Pueblo peoples did not end with the departure from cliff dwellings and great houses. It continued in the deserts, mesas, and river valleys where new villages took root, where old traditions took new forms, and where the pulse of a culture persisted through invasion, resistance, and renewal. This final section traces how the Pueblo world endured through the upheavals of colonization, how ancient practices live on in modern times, and what it means to carry memory not in ruins, but in language, dance, and corn. The rise of the modern Pueblos. By 1300 CE, the ancestral Pueblones had migrated away from places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. They didn't vanish, they reorganized. The people established new settlements along more reliable water sources, closer to arable land and trade routes. Over time, these communities became what we now know as the modern Pueblo villages, places like Acoma Pueblo, known as Sky City, perched atop a sandstone mesa. Taos Pueblo, near the Rio Grande, with multi-storied adobe homes that have been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years. Zuni, Hopi Mesas, Isleta, Laguna, Santa Clara, and more, each with unique dialects, clan systems, and ceremonial practices. These pueblos continued many of the traditions of their ancestors: dry farming, kiva ceremonies, seasonal migration on a smaller scale, and communal governance rooted in consensus and kinship. The architectural style, thick adobe walls, flat roofs, rooftop entrances, preserved echoes of cliffside dwellings. Though outwardly smaller than Chaco's grandeur, these communities were spiritually and socially robust. They chose sustainability over scale, and that choice helped them weather what came next. The arrival of the Spanish, 1540 and after. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado arrived in the southwest with a force of hundreds, seeking the legendary Seven Cities of Gold. What he found instead were Pueblo villages peaceful, self-sufficient, and clearly non-European. Disappointed by the lack of treasure, his men demanded food and shelter, abused hospitality, and sowed mistrust. This first contact set the tone for centuries of colonial pressure. Over the next 150 years, Spanish expeditions returned again and again, ultimately seeking to convert the Pueblo peoples to Christianity, subjugate them under Spanish rule, extract labor and agricultural products. Missions were built beside or within Pueblo towns. Priests forbade traditional ceremonies. Kivas were burned or desecrated. Dances, songs, and sacred objects were labeled idolatry. Yet through it all, the Pueblo peoples adapted, sometimes outwardly complying while secretly preserving tradition, sometimes openly resisting. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, a moment of defiance. After decades of religious suppression, forced labor, and cultural erasure, the Pueblo world reached a breaking point. In 1680, under the leadership of a Tewa religious figure named Pape, Pueblo communities across the region coordinated a mass uprising. Messages were carried by runners with knotted cords, each knot marking the days until the revolt. When the day came, over 24 Pueblo communities rose up simultaneously. Spanish priests and settlers were killed, churches were burned, missionaries were driven out, survivors fled south to El Paso. The Pueblos retook their homeland. It was one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history. For 12 years, the Pueblo world was free from European domination. Though Spanish forces returned in 1692 and reasserted control, they never ruled the Pueblos the same way again. Religious freedom was begrudgingly tolerated. Traditional ceremonies, though still discouraged, reemerged. The revolt became a symbol of endurance, still remembered and commemorated today. Culture beneath the surface. Even as colonial power deepened, Pueblo culture persisted beneath the outward forms imposed upon it. Traditional stories were preserved through oral transmission, often wrapped in metaphor or coded language. Ceremonies were moved to secret locations or adapted to Christian calendar dates to avoid persecution. Dances were renamed, songs rewritten, but their core meaning endured. The Kiva system survived, evolving alongside Christian churches. Many Pueblos today maintain dual religious structures, a Catholic church and a traditional Kiva society, often within sight of each other. Pottery, weaving, and farming techniques continued. Seeds saved from ancient times, especially blue corn, remained sacred. Elders taught children not only how to plant, but when to pray, how to listen to wind, and how to walk gently through sacred space. Corn as memory. To the Pueblo peoples, corn is more than food. It is identity, life, connection to the ancestors. Corn was present at Chaco, at Mesa Verde, in cliff dwellings, and in desert fields. Its kernels fed families, its stalks offered shade, its husks wrapped sacred objects. Today, corn dances honor it. Corn pollen is still used in blessing rituals. Each variety, blue, red, white, yellow, has meaning. To plant corn in dry soil, as Pueblo farmers still do, is to express faith in the unseen. Rain may not come. Yields may be thin, but the act itself is sacred. Modern Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples still use traditional dry farming methods. They still pray before planting, still harvest by hand, still see corn not just as sustenance but as a living ancestor. The persistence of language and story. Language carries memory. Many Pueblo communities still speak their ancestral languages: Hopi, Tewa, Keres, Zuni, languages unrelated to English or Spanish, carrying within them the logic and worldview of the ancient builders. These languages are oral, with complex verb systems, ceremonial vocabularies, and place-based metaphors. Teaching them is an act of preservation and defiance. Every phrase spoken today is a thread tied back to the dwellings of Chaco and the stories whispered in cliff shadows. Traditional stories continue to explain the origin of the world, the cycles of nature, and the roles of animals, spirits, and clans. These are not myths in the modern sense. They are truths remembered in performance, not written in books. Even today, Pueblo children hear the stories of migration, emergence, and return, the same stories carved into the minds of their ancestors 1,000 years ago. Modern Pueblos, living cities. Today, 19 Pueblo communities remain in New Mexico and Arizona. They are not ruins. They are living cities with governments, schools, farms, and vibrant art scenes. At Taos Pueblo, people still live in the same adobe homes their ancestors did centuries ago, without electricity or running water by choice. At Zuni, traditional carving, beadwork, and ceremonial dances continue year-round. Acoma remains high atop its mesa, still called Sky City, still sacred. In Hopi mesas, dry farming continues, corn grown without irrigation, fed by prayers and clouds. Challenges remain: climate change, economic hardship, water rights, cultural appropriation. But so does resilience. Pueblo communities today walk the line between tradition and modernity, ceremony and sovereignty, remembering not only who they were but who they still are. The final reflection. The ruins of the Southwest are often framed as signs of a lost civilization, but to the Pueblo peoples, nothing is lost. Chaco, Mesa Verde, and Canyon de Chelly are not tombs, they are chapters. The story continues in whispered songs, dance steps, hand-formed clay, and blue corn planted into the desert dust. So we return to the beginning and we ask, if the past never truly ended, but simply moved, what might we learn by listening not just to stones, but to the people who still remember what the stones were trying to say? Story 4, Turtle Island Traders, the wampum economy of the Northeast. Before the clink of coins, before contracts and currency, before European ships crossed the Atlantic with silver in their holds and debt in their ledgers, there were shells. Carefully shaped, patiently carved, and strung together into beads, these shells became something more than decoration. They were memory. They were honor. They were wampum. To many indigenous peoples of the northeastern woodlands, particularly the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois Confederacy, Lenape, and Algonquian-speaking nations, wampum was a currency of meaning rather than money. It bound treaties, sealed marriages, marked loss, recorded laws, and honored truth. In this story, we'll explore the complex and often misunderstood economic and ceremonial world of wampum, long before the arrival of Europeans, and how its role was not simply transactional, but deeply spiritual and social. Wampum did not store wealth, it stored trust. The land of rivers and trees. The northeastern woodlands, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast, from the Ohio River to southern Canada, were thick with forests, lakes, and river systems. In this densely wooded environment, indigenous nations formed tightly knit networks interlinked by trails, waterways, and seasonal migration. Villages were often semi-permanent. People lived in longhouses or wigwams, surrounded by cornfields, forests, and rivers. Communities moved as needed, following cycles of planting, hunting, and fishing. Trade was essential not just for goods, but for relationships. Into this world emerged a medium that was both tangible and symbolic: wampum. What is wampum? The word wampum comes from the Algonquian wampumpeeg, meaning white strings of beads. These beads were made primarily from two types of shells. White whelk shells, Bisicotopus canaliculatus, used to create the lighter-colored beads. Purple quahog clam shells, Mercenaria mercenaria, which were rarer and more valued for their deeper hue. The process of creating wampum was meticulous. Shells were broken, shaped into small cylinders and drilled using bow drills tipped with stone or later copper. Each bead could take hours to make. They were then polished until smooth, strung on cords made of plant fiber or sinew, and woven into belts, strings, or worn as personal adornment. The result was not merely ornamentation. Wampum became a medium of communication, akin to written language. The role of wampum before European contact. Long before colonists ever saw a bead of wampum, indigenous nations had developed a highly organized symbolic economy based around it. But wampum was never used like coins are today. It had multiple overlapping functions. 1. Mnemonic record keeping. Wampum belts acted as memory devices, used to record and retell important events, treaties, battles, clan relationships, and legal agreements. The patterns of white and purple beads were not decorative, they encoded meaning, remembered and recited by designated keepers of the wampum. A treaty was not binding because it was signed, it was binding because the belt was created, witnessed, and remembered. In councils, a speaker would hold the belt while reciting the story or terms it represented. Different belts recorded: birth or death of a chief, clan transfers or adoptions, military alliances or truces, laws of confederacies. These belts were often cared for by elders, hidden, protected, and passed down through generations. 2. Ceremonial exchange. Wampum was often exchanged in diplomatic settings as a gesture of sincerity. When visiting another village or entering a negotiation, a speaker might present a string of wampum to signify peaceful intent. A gift of wampum was not only symbolic, it demonstrated accountability. At funerals, wampum strings were offered to the bereaved as tokens of shared mourning. In marriage, wampum belts could symbolize the bond between clans. In reconciliation, the gift of wampum marked an acceptance of apology. 3. Trade and prestige. Though wampum was not money in the European sense, it did have value. It was labor-intensive to produce, relatively rare, and not easily faked. Wampum might be traded for goods, fur, food, tools, but its use varied by region and context. Among the Haudenosaunee, for example, wampum was more ceremonial and political, whereas among some coastal Algonquian peoples, it could play a larger role in market-style trade. But even in trade, wampum retained its symbolic weight. To trade in wampum was to enter into a relationship, not just an exchange. The making of wampum: patience, skill, and spirituality. Producing wampum beads was not casual labor. It required shell collection, often performed during low tides or at specific coastal harvesting times. Breaking and shaping, using stone or bone tools to reduce the shell to workable sizes. Drilling, a delicate process requiring hours per bead, often with tools made of quartz or copper. Polishing, done with sand or sandstone to create a smooth, tactile surface. In some traditions, the creation of wampum was ritualized. Certain prayers or songs might be used. Bead makers were often members of specific families or lineages entrusted with the craft. The beads were not only beautiful, they were alive with intention. Each one carried not just value, but voice. The Haudenosaunee and the Great Law of Peace. Perhaps the most well-known example of wampum's political significance is its use by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League. Founded before European contact, some say as early as the 12th century, the Confederacy united the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. This union was governed by the Great Law of Peace, an oral constitution passed down through generations. Key laws and agreements of this confederacy were recorded in wampum belts, including the Hiawatha Belt, showing the 5 original nations joined by a white tree of peace. Belts recording council procedures, clan roles, and protocols for resolving disputes. Wampum here was not passive, it was political infrastructure. The belts were brought out during deliberations, read aloud, and reinterpreted as needed. Their symbolism shaped decision-making and ensured continuity across generations. This use of symbolic record-keeping challenged colonial assumptions that native societies were without law or without writing. The laws were written in beads. Trade networks and wampum's reach. Wampum-producing tribes along the Atlantic coast, especially in what is now Long Island, New England, and New Jersey, produced large quantities of beads from local shellfish. These belts and beads traveled inland through extensive trade routes. Wampum moved westward into the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley, northward into Canada and the Algonquin territories, southward along the coast and into Delaware and beyond. It was traded for goods like furs, flint tools, food staples, medicinal herbs. But unlike gold or silver, wampum was never entirely divorced from its social role. It could be traded, yes, but it also had to be respected. Misuse or careless spending of wampum could erode a person's honor or clan standing. The question of currency. Was wampum money? The answer is not quite, and also much more. To define wampum only as currency flattens its meaning. Wampum wasn't just an economic tool, it was a relational tool. It held the past, acknowledged the present, and committed to the future. Its value was not set by markets but by memory and meaning. Colonists would later try to standardize wampum, assigning it fixed values, minting imitation beads, and forcing it into European molds. But before all that, wampum was fluid, sacred, and embedded in a web of reciprocity and remembrance. The unresolved thread. So as we sit beside a council fire in the northeastern woods, and an elder reaches into a bundle to draw out a belt strung with ancient beads, each one polished by hand, each one placed with care, we are not watching someone count money. We are watching someone remember. And so we ask, what would a world look like if its wealth was measured not in possession, but in promises remembered and kept? In Section 1, we explored the origins of wampum, its careful creation from shell, its ceremonial and mnemonic uses, and its importance to pre-contact indigenous societies as more than just a form of exchange. We now move into the heart of its power, how wampum governed relationships, preserved law, and held together vast diplomatic networks. This is the story of sovereignty encoded in beads, a history where every shell was a syllable in a living constitution, and every belt a compact of honor, not just history. The belt as a document. Before pens and paper arrived on the shores of Turtle Island, indigenous peoples had already developed systems of recording events and obligations. While these weren't written in letters or bound in books, they were remembered, and wampum belts were the embodiment of those memories. Each wampum belt was a physical manifestation of an agreement, a law, or a shared moment. And it was not read silently. It was read aloud, often by the person who had created it or by a designated keeper. These belts were not owned individually, but were usually held by clan mothers or matrilineal heads who carried political and ceremonial authority. Wampum keepers, entrusted with guarding and interpreting the belts. Elders and orators, whose role was to pass down the context and interpretation through oral tradition. Each belt had a specific design, with sequences of white and purple beads forming shapes, lines, and motifs. The design itself could be read, but only in conjunction with the oral interpretation, a shared act of memory. In this way, wampum was both symbol and speech. Wampum in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Among the most sophisticated users of wampum were the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, a political union of nations bound by a constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. The Great Law wasn't written down in scrolls or on parchment. Instead, its principles were remembered, recited, and represented in belts. The Hiawatha Belt. One of the most famous belts is the Hiawatha Belt. It is made of white beads, with 5 connected symbols in purple. A central tree, the Tree of Peace, representing the Onondaga Nation. 2 squares on either side, symbolizing the Mohawk and Seneca, the easternmost and westernmost nations. 2 lines connecting the symbols, indicating the unity of the Confederacy. The entire belt signifies the formation of the Union and the laws that hold it together. This belt was more than an artifact. It was a constitution invoked during council meetings, clan gatherings, and diplomatic negotiations. When a belt was brought out, it commanded respect, and the speaker was expected to recite its associated laws accurately and completely. Wampum as diplomatic protocol. Long before Europeans arrived, the indigenous nations of the Northeast had developed protocols for diplomacy using wampum. When emissaries approached a village or a gathering, they presented a wampum string or belt as a sign of peace. This acted as a verbal handshake, signaling that the speaker came with good intentions. During negotiations, belts were exchanged at key moments. To open talks, to mark agreements, to mourn losses or acknowledge grievances, to seal pacts, whether temporary truces or long-standing alliances. The exchange of wampum created a moral obligation. It said, "I remember, and you will remember." The term often used in Haudenosaunee diplomacy was Guswenta, the 2-row wampum. This referred to a specific belt that would later become a critical symbol in indigenous settler relations. The 2-row wampum, a symbol of sovereignty. The 2-row wampum belt, Kaswenta, is perhaps the most enduring and profound diplomatic wampum belt in North American history. It was created to commemorate a 1613 agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Dutch settlers, and later invoked with other European powers. The belt consists of 2 parallel purple rows on a white background. The purple rows represent 2 vessels, a European ship and a Haudenosaunee canoe. The rows run side by side, symbolizing coexistence without interference. Each party was to stay in their own vessel, steering their own way, following their own laws and customs, neither trying to steer the other. This belt was not a treaty in the Western legal sense. It was a living agreement, renewed through ceremony, oral tradition, and shared understanding. The message was clear: sovereignty, peace, and parallel paths. And for generations, this belt has been brought forward in court cases, land negotiations, and cultural revitalization efforts, not as nostalgia, but as active law. Wampum and the arrival of Europeans. As European colonists expanded into indigenous territories, they encountered wampum in many forms. As a gift during first contact, as a medium of diplomacy, as payment in trade or alliances. At first, Europeans misunderstood its significance. They saw it as primitive currency or mere decoration. But over time, colonists learned to use wampum strategically, offering it during treaties, accepting it in fur trade, and even minting their own imitation wampum beads to influence trade and diplomacy. The Dutch and later the English attempted to assign fixed monetary values to wampum, e.g., 6 beads for 1 penny. They began producing glass beads and flooding trade markets. This commodification of wampum undermined its ceremonial function and severed it from its original meaning. Still, indigenous nations continued to use wampum in their traditional ways, even as colonial governments tried to redefine its purpose. Wampum and treaty violations. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as European and later American governments signed treaties and then broke them, many indigenous leaders responded by bringing out wampum belts in council meetings. A belt might be laid across a table as a reminder. This is what we agreed to. You were there. You accepted it. The belt remembers even if you pretend to forget. But increasingly, colonial powers dismissed wampum as non-binding. Courts ignored oral agreements. The belts were confiscated, stored in museums, or lost to history. Yet in indigenous communities, the belts continued to be remembered, kept in safekeeping, brought out for teaching, and passed from hand to hand. Wampum today, revival and recognition. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a movement began to reclaim wampum both as physical objects and as living tradition. Language schools and cultural centers now teach beadmaking and wampum literacy. Wampum belts, once held by museums, are being repatriated to their rightful communities. Ceremonies honoring old treaties have revived the belts as legal and ethical documents. Artists and activists are creating new belts to represent contemporary agreements, commemorations, and acts of solidarity. In this way, wampum remains alive not as a relic, but as a thread of continuity between generations. The unfinished story. Today, when an elder unwraps a wampum belt, kneels before a fire, and begins to speak not reading from paper, but from memory, we witness a moment older than nations. The shell beads shimmer with age, but their message is current. And we ask, if law can be remembered in silence, if justice can be strung on a cord of shell, what does that say about the way we choose to remember our promises? We've followed wampum from its origin in quiet coastal coves, through the hands of diplomats and orators, and into the belts that carried the memories of law, peace, and kinship. In this final section of Story 4, we arrive in the modern era, a world where wampum faced cultural erasure, commodification, and misunderstanding. Yet, like so many elements of indigenous resilience, wampum did not vanish. It went quiet, hidden in trunks, remembered by elders, whispered through stories, and taught in kitchens and workshops when the time was right. Now, in the face of modern pressures and injustices, wampum returns as an emblem of sovereignty, a teacher of memory, and a reminder that not all laws are written in ink. Decline and disruption, the assault on memory. By the 1800s, the systems that had once held wampum at the heart of indigenous diplomacy and governance were under siege. Colonial authorities dismissed oral treaties as informal or irrelevant. Missionaries discouraged or outright banned the use of traditional ceremonies involving wampum, labeling them as pagan. Collectors and museums removed thousands of belts and strings from their communities, often without consent, and stored them as artifacts, divorced from their stories. In the wake of forced removals, residential schools, language suppression, and outlawed ceremonies, much of the oral context of wampum was endangered. A belt without its story is like a book with its pages torn out. The patterns remain, but the meaning fades. Still, in many communities, elders continued to protect the belts, sometimes in secret. They passed on fragments of knowledge, taught children how to handle the beads with care, and waited for a time when they could be spoken of again. Reclaiming the beads, restoring the meaning. In the late 20th century, indigenous nations across North America began to revitalize traditional knowledge systems, and wampum was at the center of that movement. 1. Repatriation efforts. Many of the wampum belts held in museums or private collections were requested back by their rightful communities. In 1988, the Onondaga Nation successfully repatriated the Hiawatha Belt from the Museum of the American Indian. Efforts continue today to identify and return belts held in museums across the U.S., Canada, and Europe. The process is often slow and filled with legal complexity, but every returned belt is a homecoming of memory. Repatriation is not just about possession, it's about reviving the oral histories connected to the belts. Once returned, belts are often used in ceremonial teaching, not hidden behind glass. 2. Language and storytelling revival. As indigenous language programs gained momentum, they brought back not just grammar, but ceremonial vocabulary, the specific phrases and terms used when interpreting wampum. Language learners studied with fluent elders, some of whom still remembered wampum protocols. Wampum interpreters, a once endangered role, began to reemerge. Community gatherings began to once again open with wampum, especially in Haudenosaunee councils. This revival is not about nostalgia, it is about continuity. Modern uses of wampum. Today, wampum has taken on new forms while honoring its old spirit. In indigenous communities across the Northeast and beyond, it continues to 1. Mark new agreements. New belts are being made to commemorate land acknowledgements and the return of territories. Intertribal treaties of solidarity and mutual aid. Declarations of language revitalization. Protests and movements, such as Idle No More or the Wet'suwet'en Land Defense. These belts serve the same purpose as those made centuries ago: to remember, to bind, to promise. 2. Educate and inspire. Wampum belts are used in classrooms, language nests, and workshops to teach history from within the culture, rather than through colonial narratives. Youth learn how to make beads from shell, how to interpret belts, the meanings behind patterns, knots, and colors, the role of wampum in sovereignty and diplomacy. Some communities have built wampum archives, not museums, but living spaces where belts are stored, shared, and interpreted. 3. Bridge legal traditions. In court cases and negotiations with federal or provincial governments, some indigenous leaders now invoke wampum belts as part of their legal reasoning. While Western courts may not always recognize oral treaties or belts as binding, their presence in negotiations asserts the ongoing sovereignty and historical memory of the nations involved. And for indigenous peoples, that assertion is often more important than outside recognition. Cultural continuity through craft. Wampum making itself is an act of resistance and survival. Modern wampum artisans, some trained by elders, others self-taught, harvest shells, craft beads, and string them using both traditional and adapted methods. Some use hand tools as in centuries past. Others use drills and sanding machines, but the intention remains sacred. Artisans must also navigate sustainability. Overharvesting of quahog clams has environmental consequences. Ethical sourcing, balancing access with respect for tradition. Cultural appropriation, confronting the misuse of wampum designs or belts by non-indigenous groups. To make a belt today is not to recreate the past, it is to continue it. The beads remember. Wampum is not just heritage, it is history you can touch, law you can hold, and memory woven into matter. It resists the erosion of time, because it is not made only of shell, it is made of meaning, held together by responsibility. To receive a belt is to receive a charge, to remember, to carry, to speak. To create a belt is to make a promise to future generations. The final reflection. In a world that increasingly favors speed over memory, transaction over relationship, and documentation over trust, wampum stands as a quiet alternative. It asks us to consider: what if law were performed, not printed? What if memory lived in our hands, not in files? What if a promise could be held, passed down, and still honored 100 winters later? And so we end with a final question. If every shell in a wampum belt remembers a story, and every belt remembers a nation, what does it mean that they are still speaking? And are we listening? Story 5. Frozen rivers, warm fires, the Dene and Inuit ways of life. Before contact, before the arrival of ships with sails and goods with prices, before the names of Hudson, Franklin, or Cartier appeared on maps, there were people who lived in a world of snow, stone, and sky. They did not build monuments of earth or carve cities into cliffs. Their lives left fewer marks footsteps in snow, soot on a caribou hide tent, or bone tools tucked into the folds of tundra earth. And yet these lives were rich in knowledge, shaped by kinship, sustained by hunting and spiritual balance. This is the story of the Dene and the Inuit, two distinct cultural groups whose ancestors thrived in the vast and unforgiving regions of northern Canada and Alaska long before European contact. One made their homes just north of the tree line, where black spruce thinned into frozen openness. The other ranged further north still, beyond the last trees, along coasts carved by glaciers, across sea ice that cracked and moved like breathing stone. In the cold, they created warmth not just in fires, but in community, memory, and respect for the land that gave just enough to those who listened carefully. The subarctic and Arctic worlds. The Dene are a broad group of Athabascan-speaking peoples who lived in the subarctic region, a land of taiga forests, rivers, lakes, muskeg, and long winters. This region, stretching across modern-day Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and parts of Alaska and British Columbia, was cold, remote, and seasonal. North of the Dene lands, across the Arctic Circle, lived the Inuit, once referred to broadly as Eskimo, a term now recognized as outdated and offensive in many contexts. The Inuit lived in the Arctic tundra, a treeless region where survival meant not adaptation to winter, but residence within it. These were not the same people. They spoke different languages, used different tools, and lived in different ecological zones. But both developed lifeways rooted in resilience, respect, and a deep knowledge of the environments around them. They were never primitive, they were precise. The Dene, river people of the subarctic. The word Dene simply means people in many Athabascan languages. Groups like the Chipewyan, Slavey, Tlicho, Dogrib, and Yellowknives fall under this larger umbrella. Their world was shaped by movement across rivers in the summer and along frozen trails in winter. They traveled in birchbark canoes, on foot, or using toboggans pulled by dogs. The rivers were their highways, and fish, especially whitefish and trout, were their staples. Their shelters were adapted to the season. In summer, they built conical tents of poles and hide, easily packed and moved. In winter, they built more insulated brush or caribou skin tents, heated with stone hearths and maintained with careful venting. Hunting focused on caribou, moose, and small game. They followed the migratory routes of herds, timing their movements to match the patterns of animals that had no fences or boundaries. Nothing was wasted. Caribou hide became clothing, bones became tools, sinew became thread. Food was dried, smoked, or cached in pits sealed from animals and insulated against the cold. Every Dene group knew their land intimately, its trails, feeding grounds, fish spawning spots, berry patches, and wind patterns. The land was not wilderness, it was home. The Inuit, masters of the sea ice. Further north, the Inuit lived where most would not dare to linger. In what is now Nunavut, northern Quebec, Nunavik, Labrador, Nunatsiavut, and parts of Alaska and Greenland, they developed a culture that turned ice, snow, and stone into a functioning world. Their homes included tents made from seal or caribou skins in warmer months. The iconic igloo, a dome of packed snow blocks, expertly carved and placed to insulate and protect against storms. Semi-subterranean sod houses, used in areas where snow alone was insufficient. Food came not from farming, but from the sea and ice. Seal, hunted through breathing holes with harpoons. Whale, hunted cooperatively and with great ceremony. Fish, caught through ice holes using bone-tipped spears. Caribou, when they migrated inland. Bird eggs, berries, and other gathered foods during the short summer. The kajak, kayak, and umiak, larger skin boat, allowed for agile travel across the sea. The Kamutik sled carried supplies across frozen tundra, pulled by dog teams that were carefully bred and trained. Everything about Inuit life reflected precision in timing, in tools, and in movement. Mistakes were costly. Success was quiet and shared. Clothing as technology. In both cultures, clothing was not decoration, it was engineering. Dene people wore caribou or moose hides, tanned with brains and smoke-cured. Inuit parkas were made from caribou, seal, or polar bear, often with double layers, one with fur facing in, one out. Boots were insulated with dried moss or grass. Sealskin was waterproofed with oil. Hoods were shaped to prevent frostbite, sleeves designed to keep out snow. A well-made parka was a work of art and survival. The sewing itself, done with bone needles and sinew thread, was ceremonial. Mistakes in stitching could be corrected not just for fit, but because they could affect luck in hunting. Oral traditions and spiritual life. Neither the Dene nor the Inuit developed writing before contact, but they had deep oral traditions, full of stories, teachings, and cosmologies. For the Dene, the world was animated by spirits in animals, rivers, rocks, and sky. Stories told of Yamoria, a powerful cultural figure who tamed monsters and shaped the land. Dreams and visions guided hunters and healers. The medicine person, often a man or woman who had undergone significant trials, served as a healer, guide, and keeper of knowledge. For the Inuit, the spiritual world was imminent, and everywhere blizzards could carry spirits, the sea could punish disrespect. The figure of Sedna, the sea mother, was central. She controlled sea animals and had to be appeased through ritual. Shamans, called Angakuk, communicated with spirits, diagnosed illness, and maintained balance. Both cultures practiced communal ceremonies, rites of passage, and naming traditions that connected children to ancestors. Knowledge was passed down through story, not lecture through practice, not textbooks. A different kind of wealth. There was no currency, no banks, no gold or silver, but there was wealth. Knowledge of trails, herds, weather, and stories. Reputation. A generous hunter was respected, a stingy one distrusted. Skill. A good seamstress was as vital as a good tracker. Kinship. Family networks stretched across vast distances, offering safety and support. Sharing was not optional, it was expected. When a seal was caught, its meat and fat were distributed widely. The one who caught it might eat last, but their honor grew with each bite shared. The question of primitive. Colonial records often describe these peoples as primitive, nomadic, or simple. But this view failed and still fails to grasp the complexity of adaptation these communities achieved. They lived in environments that outsiders found lethal. They moved without metal or wheels, yet with precision. Their technologies, boats, sleds, tools, clothing, were perfectly calibrated to the land. They did not build walls. They did not need to. Their economies were based not on accumulation, but on balance. The unresolved thought. And so we picture a small fire flickering inside a snow-block igloo, or a caribou hide tent gently rustling as wind passes across the taiga. A child listens to a story while someone shapes a bone tool by lamplight. The air is cold, but the world is alive with sound, meaning, and memory. And we ask, if a society leaves few ruins but survives where others would perish, should we measure its greatness by what it built or by what it remembered? In Section 1, we explored how the Dene and Inuit peoples thrived in the subarctic and Arctic landscapes, places often viewed by outsiders as too harsh, too remote, too barren to support complex societies. But survival here was not about brute strength. It was about cooperation, knowledge, and precision. Now, in Section 2, we move deeper into the structures of community life, the social systems, spiritual practices, and survival strategies that help these northern peoples endure not just the cold, but the solitude, the silence, and the ever-changing landscapes of snow and ice. Here, culture wasn't built in stone, but in stories, shared meat, and footprints carefully placed across the frozen ground. Kinship and mobility, how families moved together. Among both the Dene and Inuit, kinship was the basic unit of organization. Extended families, multiple generations traveled, hunted, and survived together. But these weren't villages in the fixed European sense. Instead, bands or small groups moved seasonally, following patterns of animals, ice breakup, river freeze, or berry ripening. A Dene band in summer might consist of 30-50 people living in riverside camps. By winter, they might split into smaller family units to better manage scarce resources. Mobility was everything. Paths through the forest or tundra weren't random, they were routes of return, known and maintained across generations. Families had territories, not in the colonial sense of ownership, but in the form of stewardship, places known for generations, with names for every hill, lake, or bend in the river. When groups gathered for trade, for summer hunting, for ceremony, it was a time of renewal. Marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, knowledge was shared. Even in the vast emptiness of the north, no one was truly alone. Leadership without lords. Neither the Dene nor the Inuit had kings, chiefs in the European sense, or a ruling class. Leadership was based on skill, wisdom, and generosity. A respected elder might guide a group, but they ruled by influence, not command. Consensus mattered. Harmony mattered. Those who disrupted social cohesion through greed, deceit, or violence might be warned, isolated, or in extreme cases, expelled. Inuit society, especially, valued moderation and emotional restraint. Loud boastfulness, harsh punishment, or public scolding were frowned upon. Instead, people led by example. A great hunter did not flaunt his catch, he shared it, quietly, efficiently, often giving away the best cuts. Respect was earned by generosity and composure, not domination. The power of naming and story. In both cultures, names carried weight. A child might be named after a relative, an ancestor, or a spirit figure believed to carry forward aspects of that person's soul or identity. Naming wasn't random, it was a cultural inheritance. Stories were how children learned about the world, not through written books, but through long, patient oral narratives told in winter lodges, beside lamps or fires, passed down word for word. These stories did not always explain, they evoked. How raven brought light to the world. How the animals once spoke and made rules. Why the caribou gave itself only to those who honored it. Why snow listens, and the wind is never truly alone. These were not only entertainments, they were education, cosmology, ethics, and law. They taught how to behave, how to survive, how to understand a world where the sun might vanish for months, or where the ice could break beneath your feet without warning. Ceremony in cold places. Despite their harsh environments, Dene and Inuit societies had rich ceremonial lives. Among the Dene, drumming and singing played a central role in storytelling and ritual. The drum dance gathered communities to honor life events, give thanks for successful hunts, or seek healing. Healing ceremonies might involve song cycles, medicine plants, and the guidance of a medicine person, someone with both spiritual vision and knowledge of illness. Dreams were taken seriously. A dream of an animal, place, or person might guide a journey or hunt. Among the Inuit, the Angakuk shaman held great importance, capable of spirit travel, healing, and communication with animal powers. A shaman might enter trance, ask questions of spirits, or retrieve lost souls. Ceremonies could include sacred songs, gesture dances, and the use of tools imbued with spirit, such as drums, masks, or charms. Ceremonial life was not separated from daily life, it flowed through it. A successful hunt might require more than skill, it might depend on ritual purity, respect for taboos, and a balance between the living and the unseen. Survival strategies and ingenious tools. In both Dene and Inuit cultures, survival was not about endurance alone, it was about intelligence and innovation. Some examples. 1. Inuit snow goggles. To avoid snow blindness during long treks, Inuit people carved narrow slits into pieces of bone or driftwood, fitting them over their eyes. These acted as early sunglasses, limiting the light that could enter. 2. Dene fish traps and ice fishing. Dene communities constructed intricate fish weirs from willow and stone in rivers. In winter, they cut holes in lake ice, lowering baited hooks or baskets to catch fish when no other food was available. 3. Sled technology. The Kamutik, or Inuit sled, was built without nails using rawhide lashings that flexed as it moved over uneven ice. This absorbed shock, preventing cracking. Runners were often coated in ice to reduce friction. 4. Cache systems. Meat from a successful hunt, especially whale or caribou, was often stored in elevated cache platforms Dene, or in snow-sealed ice cellars Inuit, safe from animals and spoilage. 5. Communication across distance. Both cultures used Inuksuk stone markers built into the landscape to indicate directions, dangerous areas, or hunting grounds. These served as maps in a world without signs or roads. Education by doing. There were no schools in the modern sense, but there was constant education. A child learned how to build a fire by watching, not through lectures. A girl learned to sew by helping her mother prepare skins, thread sinew, and stitch by moonlight. A boy learned to track animals by walking behind his father, step by step, in silence, reading the land. Teaching was experiential, apprentice-based, and often gendered, but always rooted in relationship. Even games were tools for training teaching dexterity, patience, memory, or hand-eye coordination. Conflict, peace, and justice. Violence was rare but not absent. When disputes arose over hunting grounds, broken marriage agreements, or violations of taboo, they were settled through dialogue, shame, compensation, or in extreme cases, banishment. Among the Inuit, serious offenses were remembered in song. Satirical or shamming songs might be sung publicly to address a dispute, inviting the offender to respond. This created a space for resolution without direct confrontation. In Dene culture, medicine people or elders acted as mediators, interpreting dreams or stories to bring harmony. Punishment was not the goal, restoration was. The coming changes. As the 1400s closed and the 1500s began, neither the Dene nor the Inuit had yet encountered Europeans. But the ripples of change carried through distant trade routes and intertribal contact were beginning to reach them. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, they would see the introduction of metal tools, which revolutionized hunting and food preparation. Firearms, which reshaped the balance of power and dependency. Diseases, against which they had no immunity. Missionaries, who would challenge their spiritual systems. Fur traders, who would reshape their economies. But at the close of the 1400s, the Dene and Inuit still lived in full autonomy, guided by the land, their ancestors, and the paths they had walked for generations. They had no written books, but they remembered the snow, the thought in the wind. So we picture again a single line of footprints across a frozen river, a small fire in the lee of a stone, a child helping a parent lash a sled, a woman singing softly as she sews. And we ask, if wisdom lives not in buildings, but in how one moves across a fragile landscape, then how many brilliant civilizations have we failed to recognize, not because they disappeared, but because they left behind nothing that could be stolen? By the end of the 1400s, the world of the Dene and the Inuit remained largely untouched by Europe's expanding empires. Far from the spice routes and gold-hungry conquistadors, they lived by the movement of caribou and the shifting cracks in sea ice. But by the early 1500s and beyond, that would change. This final section of Story 5 follows the early contacts between northern peoples and European explorers, the transformations that followed, and the ways these communities held on to and continue to reclaim the knowledge that sustained them for thousands of years. Because some cultures build monuments to be remembered, others, like the Dene and Inuit, remember by living. Whispers of Change. The earliest impact of European expansion on northern peoples was indirect. Even before explorers set foot in Arctic regions, trade goods began moving through indigenous networks. Copper kettles, knives, and beads reached Dene groups via Cree and Ojibwe middlemen. Rumors of strangers speaking strange languages or bringing disease filtered northward through oral reports. For the Inuit of the eastern Arctic, however, first contact came more directly and earlier than many might expect. Inuit and the Norse, an early forgotten encounter. Between the 10th and 15th centuries, Norse explorers and settlers from Greenland intermittently sailed along the coast of present-day Labrador and Baffin Island. These Norse were searching for timber, trade, and walrus ivory. Inuit oral histories, especially among the Inuktitut of northwest Greenland, refer to contact with Kavlunate, often interpreted to mean foreigners, including Norsemen. Archaeological finds along the coasts of Baffin Island suggest trade, conflict, or at least coexistence between these groups. Some Norse textiles and wooden artifacts have been found in Inuit sites. Likewise, Inuit-style tools appear in Norse settlements in Greenland. But the Norse eventually vanished from the region. The Inuit remained. And their stories continued. Early European contact in the north. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European explorers began pushing northward. Martin Frobisher, 1576–1578, landed in Baffin Island and attempted to mine ore, capturing Inuit individuals and bringing them to England, where they died soon after, misunderstood and mourned only in passing. Henry Hudson, seeking a passage to Asia, sailed into the bay that now bears his name in 1610. His crew mutinied, leaving him to vanish in the Arctic cold. Along the way, they likely encountered Dene or Cree groups. Samuel Hearne, an English explorer in the 1770s, was guided by Dene people on a long overland journey, documenting subarctic life in rare detail, though always filtered through colonial eyes. These early contacts were often fraught, limited in depth, and tinged with misunderstanding. Europeans often viewed the Dene and Inuit as curiosities, people to observe, trade with, or exploit, but rarely to learn from. And yet, it was the local knowledge of these people that kept many explorers alive. Trade, transformation, and dependency. With contact came trade, and trade brought transformation. For the Dene, metal knives replaced stone ones. Muskets changed hunting practices and power dynamics. Cloth and kettles altered clothing and cooking methods. Alcohol and disease disrupted communities already living at the edge of subsistence. The fur trade drew Dene peoples into colonial economic systems, often diverting them from seasonal migrations in order to trap animals valued in Europe. Trapping became a livelihood, but it also created dependency on foreign goods and currency. For the Inuit, the introduction of firearms altered the balance between hunter and prey. Steel tools improved efficiency, but gradually displaced traditional skills. Whaling ships and trading posts brought tobacco, flour, and tea, alongside disease and social upheaval. Still, Inuit and Dene peoples maintained remarkable adaptability. They incorporated new materials without abandoning core lifeways. A caribou hide parka might now be stitched with steel needles. A kajak might be stored next to a rifle. The old knowledge remained beneath the new. Cultural suppression and survival. In the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial governments imposed policies designed to erase indigenous cultures. These included missionary schools, which taught Christian doctrine while forbidding traditional beliefs; residential schools, where children were taken from their families, punished for speaking their language, and subjected to horrific abuse; forced settlement policies, which relocated nomadic communities to fixed villages, undermining seasonal lifeways; bans on ceremonial practices, including drum dances, shamanic healing, and traditional naming. And yet, through this period of trauma, both Dene and Inuit communities kept fragments alive, sometimes openly, often in secret. Elders told stories at night, even if forbidden. Hunters passed on land knowledge during official trapping trips. Ceremonies were performed quietly, at a distance, beyond the reach of authorities. Contemporary revitalization. In the 21st century, Dene and Inuit communities across Canada, Alaska, and Greenland are engaged in powerful efforts to revive and reclaim their cultures. One language renewal. Programs in schools and communities are teaching Dene languages like Tilichoyatia and Densulane, Inuktitut, Inuinnaqtun, and other dialects of the Inuit language family. Elders serve as teachers. Storytellers are being recorded. Language apps and immersion schools are helping younger generations reconnect. 2. Land-based education. Youth are being taught not just in classrooms, but on the land. How to build shelters, how to track and trap, how to prepare traditional foods, how to understand weather patterns, snow quality, and animal behavior. This knowledge is not archaic, it is living science. 3. Cultural sovereignty. From community-run governments to Inuit-controlled media, indigenous groups are asserting control over their stories, spaces, and systems. Modern Inuit filmmakers, artists, and authors are telling stories rooted in ancient landscapes. Dene political leaders speak in their own languages at national forums. The traditions once deemed primitive are now recognized as sources of wisdom. Climate change and the new challenge. Today, Dene and Inuit communities face a different kind of threat, not from colonial expansion, but from climate change. Permafrost is melting, destabilizing homes and historic sites. Sea ice forms later, making hunting riskier. Animal migration patterns shift, breaking seasonal rhythms. Weather becomes unpredictable, undermining traditional knowledge built on generations of observation. And yet, indigenous voices are leading global conversations about climate adaptation, sustainability, and ecological balance. Their message is clear. This land has taught us how to live. It can teach the rest of the world, too, if we are willing to listen. The final reflection. There are no great temples in the Arctic, no pyramids in the Muskeg, but there are footsteps across frozen lakes, along tundra ridges, through forests veiled in snow. Those footsteps are stories, each one a choice, to endure, to adapt, to remember. So we return to the quiet moment. A hunter stands beside a breathing hole, listening. A child sits in a sod house, hearing a story about a fox who became a man. A woman threads sinew through caribou hide, her hands moving with practiced grace. And we ask, if the land itself is a library and survival is its language, then how much knowledge lives not in books but in the way people once walked, ate, sewed, and sang across the snow? Story 6. Paths in the Sky, the Mound Builders' Sacred Geometry. Before skyscrapers, before clocks, and long before maps charted longitude and latitude, there were mounds, silent, earthen structures stretching across the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Built by hand, shaped by generations, and aligned with celestial bodies, these mounds marked a world shaped by cycle, ceremony, and memory. In this first section of Story 6, we explore the Adena people, among the earliest mound builders of North America. Their constructions were not fortresses or tombs in the grand European sense, but rather symbols of spiritual geography, a quiet architecture that connected earth to sky and ancestors to the living. As we walk slowly through the forests and fields of the Ohio Valley, where many of these mounds still rise gently from the ground, we begin to ask, what kind of people shaped the land not to conquer it, but to remember? A different kind of monument. When we think of monumental architecture, we often imagine towering structures of stone, pyramids, castles, temples. But in North America, long before contact with Europe, people were building something different. From around 1000 BCE to 200 BCE, the Adena culture flourished in what is now Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, and Kentucky. They left no writing, no palaces, no metal tools, and yet what they built has lasted for over 2,000 years. They built mounds, conical burial mounds, often carefully layered with soil and gravel. Earthworks, some in geometric shaped circles, squares, or more complex patterns. Ceremonial enclosures, some aligned with solar or lunar events. Sacred landscapes, designed not for war but for the passage of time. These constructions were not accidental. They reflect a deep understanding of geometry, astronomy, and community coordination. They reflect memory. Who were the Adena? The Adena were not a single tribe or nation, but a network of related peoples sharing a common cultural pattern. They lived in small villages near rivers, building semi-permanent circular dwellings with thatched roofs and wooden frames. Villages were typically home to 20 to 50 people, living in close-knit kin groups. Subsistence came from a mix of hunting and gathering, white-tailed deer, elk, small game, nuts, berries, and roots. Horticulture. They cultivated squash, sunflower, goosefoot, and possibly early forms of maize not in large fields, but in garden plots near homes. Fishing. Streams and rivers provided steady protein, and tools such as fish weirs were common. Clothing was made from tanned hides, and ornaments included carved bone, mica, and stone beads, evidence of both local artistry and trade. Trade, roots of the forgotten. Even in this early period, the Adena participated in vast trade networks. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from the Rockies, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, pipestone from Minnesota. These goods were not just economic, they were ceremonial. Used in burials, rituals, and status displays, they speak to connection across thousands of miles, long before the development of formal states. This was not isolation, it was interaction. The mounds themselves. Most Adena mounds were conical, rising 5 to 30 feet high and ranging from 20 to over 300 feet in diameter. They were constructed in layers, often built up over time as new burials or ceremonial episodes occurred. Some notable examples. Miamisburg Mound, Ohio, over 65 feet tall, one of the largest Adena mounds still standing. Creel Mound, West Virginia, contains multiple burials and stone artifacts, likely reflecting elite or ceremonial individuals. Wolf Plains Group features both burial mounds and geometric earthworks, suggesting combined ritual functions. These mounds were not simple grave markers. Many contained central tombs, often log-lined, for individuals of status or ceremonial significance. Offerings, stone tools, carved tablets, pipes, beads, and exotic materials. Multiple burials, layered over time, indicating the mound as a communal memory project rather than a single event. Aligning with the sky. Though the Adena left no written calendars, evidence suggests they tracked astronomical cycles, especially lunar and solar events. Some circular earthworks in mounds align with solstices, points on the horizon where the sun rises or sets during the longest and shortest days of the year. Lunar standstills, points in an 18.6-year lunar cycle when the moon rises and sets at its furthest north or south. Why does this matter? Because it suggests these structures were not just burial sites, they were calendars, observatories, and ritual centers. The Adena were watching the sky, marking time, and embedding it in the soil. Their monuments were not to kings, but to cosmic rhythm, spiritual and social meaning. Adena burial mounds were likely part of a complex religious worldview. Burial wasn't about closure, it was ongoing communication with the dead. Ancestors were not gone, they were present, active, needing attention through ritual. Mounds were pilgrimage sites, places of ceremony, storytelling, and seasonal gathering. Some archaeologists believe mound construction itself was a community act of memory, with soil carried basket by basket, each layer symbolizing a moment, a life, a season. The mounds grew not only upward, but inward into identity. The question of elites. Did the Adena have rulers? Some burials show evidence of status differentiation: more ornate grave goods, larger tombs, central placement. But there is no clear evidence of centralized power or coercive hierarchy. Instead, it seems that leadership may have been spiritual rather than political, ceremonial rather than administrative, respected rather than obeyed. This challenges modern assumptions about complexity. The idea that large constructions require kings, armies, or enslaved labor. The Adena remind us, coordination can come from consensus, from shared belief, from time more than tyranny. The mystery of the disappearance. By around 200 BCE, the Adena culture faded. Not violently, but gradually, its features merged into the more widespread and complex Hopewell culture, which would expand mound building into even grander forms. The mounds remained, but their original builders stepped aside, changed, or became part of a new system. Why? Some point to climatic shift that may have changed subsistence patterns. Others suggest cultural integration, the Adena joining broader ceremonial networks. Still others believe internal changes in belief, leadership, or trade priorities led to reorganization. We may never fully know. What we do know is that the mounds remained and were reused, expanded, and revered by later peoples. A living landscape. As you walk the shaded trails around a remaining mound, its slope softened by centuries of rain, its summit now under sky, rather than ceremony, you realize this was once a center of human effort, belief, and time. Not abandoned, but remembered differently. Some local indigenous nations, including the Shawnee, Miami, and Cherokee, still tell stories of the mounds not always as literal ancestry, but as inherited memory. They know the land is not blank, it is inscribed. The thought in the earth. So we kneel by the base of a hill of shaped earth. We imagine the baskets of soil, the slow circling songs, the long remembering. And we ask, what kind of people build monuments to the sun and moon, then leave them behind not as tombs of conquest, but as calendars of spirit and soil? In Section 1, we explored the Adena culture and its foundational role in the ancient mound-building traditions of Eastern North America. But as the Adena era waned around 200 BCE, something new emerged, something larger in scope, broader in influence, and even more cosmologically aligned. This was the rise of the Hopewell culture, a term used to describe a vast ceremonial and trade network that spanned hundreds of miles, peaking between roughly 200 BCE and 500 CE. Though still rooted in small communities, the Hopewell tradition brought a new complexity to the practice of mound building, shaping earth into geometric designs so vast they can only be fully appreciated from the air. This section explores the Hopewell people's ceremonial centers, long-distance exchange systems, and their striking alignment with astronomical phenomena. Here, time was measured in shadows and solstices, and the land itself became a canvas for celestial meaning. From Adena to Hopewell, a shift in scale. The Hopewell culture wasn't a sudden replacement of the Adena. It was a gradual evolution, likely incorporating and transforming Adena traditions. Many sites show overlap between the two. But with Hopewell came significant shifts. Mounds became more varied, not only conical, but also effigy-shaped and platform style. Earthworks expanded into vast, geometric enclosures, often aligned with cardinal directions and celestial events. Trade intensified, bringing in exotic goods from thousands of miles away. Ceremony became central, and mound sites served as regional gathering places, not just burial grounds. These changes weren't about conquest. They were about ideas how to relate to the cosmos, to the dead, to each other. Ceremonial centers, not cities. Hopewell settlements remained small and scattered, with populations likely ranging from 100 to 200 people. They lived in woodland villages and practiced a mixed subsistence economy. Hunting and gathering remained key: deer, turkey, nuts, and berries. Horticulture of native plants, including goosefoot, maygrass, sunflower, and squash. Some evidence suggests early maize cultivation, though not yet dominant. But the most significant Hopewell sites were not towns or capitals. They were ceremonial landscapes, where people came seasonally or episodically to conduct rituals, burials, and inter-community gatherings. These sites, including Mound City, Hopewell Earthworks, and Sape Earthworks in present-day Ohio, contain dozens of mounds, some conical, some rectangular. Enclosures, squares, circles, and octagons made of raised earth, covering hundreds of acres. Ritual objects, often buried intentionally, including pipes, figurines, copper artwork, and animal effigies. These centers were not occupied year-round. They were pilgrimage places, sites of renewal, remembrance, and sky-watching. The geometry of the earthworks. The precision of Hopewell geometry is astonishing. Some examples. 1. Octagon Earthworks, Newark, Ohio. An octagon attached to a circular enclosure. Thought to be aligned with the lunar standstill cycle, an 18.6-year period that affects the moon's position at rising and setting. Likely used to predict lunar events, marking time in decades. 2. High Bank Works. Includes a near-perfect octagon and circle combination, spanning over 100 acres. Precise geometrical layout suggests advanced understanding of angles, distances, and sight lines. 3. Hopewell Mound Group. Includes the Great Mound, over 30 feet tall and 500 feet in diameter. Smaller mounds arranged in geometrical relation to the larger one, possibly reflecting ritual processions or cosmological models. This was not casual construction. These earthworks were engineered likely through communal labor, aligned with celestial bodies, and used for ritual purposes whose meaning is still being uncovered. Trade networks without borders. One of the most striking features of Hopewell culture is its extensive trade system, sometimes referred to as the Hopewell interaction sphere. Materials found at Hopewell sites include copper from Lake Superior, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, Yellowstone area, mica from the southern Appalachians, shark teeth and shells from the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic coast, grizzly bear teeth and mountain lion claws from the western plains, galena lead ore from Illinois, pipestone from Minnesota. These items were not traded for basic survival needs. They were symbolic, ceremonial, and often buried intentionally in mounds. Pipes carved into the shapes of birds and animals, copper breastplates, and ornate ear spools weren't everyday items. They were ritual technologies used in ceremonies that connected the living to ancestors, the earth to the sky. Pipes, ceremonies, and spirit journeys. Hopewell culture is particularly known for its stone effigy pipes, many found carefully placed within burial mounds. These pipes depict birds in flight, cougars, bears, frogs, human figures. They were not just functional, they were embodied stories. Smoking was ceremonial, likely used to enter trance states, communicate with spirits, or mark transitions between worlds. Other ceremonial practices likely included ritual feasting, body painting or tattooing, dances and chants, possibly within the earthwork enclosures, sky observation, marking solstices or eclipses. Burials often included cremation, and some graves were multi-layered, suggesting complex ritual staging over time. This was not haphazard. This was ceremonial choreography written in soil and fire. Social structure, unity without uniformity. Despite the vast distances and common ceremonial patterns, Hopewell groups were not an empire. There is no evidence of kings, armies, or centralized control. Instead, Hopewell culture appears to have been a widespread religious or cultural system, uniting many distinct communities through shared rituals, common symbolic languages, pilgrimage centers, mutual trade. Some archaeologists suggest a ritual alliance model where communities maintained autonomy but gathered periodically for shared ceremonies, marriages, or trade. This reminds us that cohesion doesn't require hierarchy. Hopewell society was complex without being coercive. The quiet decline. By around 500 CE, Hopewell's ceremonial construction began to wane. The reasons are still debated. Theories include changing climate, affecting agriculture and mobility, shifting trade networks, making distant exchange less feasible, internal cultural change, possibly favoring more localized traditions, the rise of new social structures, including chiefdoms, as seen later in Mississippian culture. Whatever the cause, the great geometric earthworks were no longer maintained. The pilgrimages ceased. The mounds stood silently, overgrown by forest but never forgotten. Some were reused by later cultures. Others were gradually swallowed by soil and time. Memory in the landscape. To stand today in the center of a Hopewell circle is to feel a kind of time that is not linear, but celestial. The rising moon still traces its ancient path. The stars still move as they did when soil was laid, pipes smoked, and songs offered to the horizon. Modern native nations, including the Shawnee, Miami, and others, see these places not as ruins, but as ancestral maps. They remember the mounds not necessarily by names like Hopewell, but as places of sacred alignment, ancestral power, and unfinished ceremony. The unresolved thought. So we picture a gathering at dusk 2,000 years ago, a circle of people waiting in silence as the moon rises over the octagon's edge. A pipe is lit, a story is told, a soul is remembered. And we ask, what does it mean when people shape the land not for power, but for memory, when geometry becomes prayer and soil becomes sky? In Section 2, we followed the Hopewell culture and its remarkable ceremonial centers, vast geometric earthworks that aligned with the heavens and connected distant communities through shared rituals and trade. But by around 500 CE, that network began to dissolve. What followed over the next few centuries was not a disappearance, but a transformation, a new chapter in mound-building tradition. It was more urban, more hierarchical, and more expansive, and it left behind cities that rivaled medieval Europe in size and complexity. In this final section of Story 6, we explore the Mississippian culture, which rose to prominence around 800 CE and dominated the southeastern and midwestern United States for centuries. At the center of this world was Cahokia, a city built of wood, thatch, and clay, but with monuments that still tower over the landscape today. This is the story of how sacred geometry became city planning, how ancestral ceremonies evolved into state religions, and how memory, once mapped in circles and lines, was reshaped into theocratic mounds and plazas before vanishing again into forest and floodplain. The rise of Mississippian culture. Around 800 CE, near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, a new cultural complex began to emerge. This Mississippian culture would eventually stretch from Wisconsin to Florida, from Oklahoma to the Carolinas. While it built on older traditions, Adena and Hopewell among them, it introduced new features. Larger platform mounds, often flat-topped and central to towns. Structured settlement, with plazas, stockades, and elite residences. Widespread maize agriculture, which supported larger populations. More formal leadership systems, often hereditary and theocratic. A distinctive artistic style, often featuring birds of prey, the sun, and warriors. At the heart of it all was Cahokia, the largest and most influential Mississippian city. Cahokia, the city of the sun. By 1050 CE, Cahokia had exploded into a metropolis. Located near modern-day St. Louis, it was a true city by any definition. Population estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 at its peak, making it larger than London at the time. The city covered 6 square miles and included over 120 mounds, along with neighborhoods, plazas, and fields. It featured the monumental Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in the Americas north of Mexico, over 100 feet tall and 1,000 feet long at its base. Cahokia was organized around a central plaza, flanked by mounds arranged in a deliberate layout. These mounds served various functions. Platform mounds held the homes or temples of elite individuals. Conical mounds served as burial sites. Some functioned as astronomical observatories. A nearby site known as Woodhen, a circle of wooden posts aligned with solstices and equinoxes, suggesting ceremonial calendar tracking, much like Hopewell earthworks before it. Society and ceremony in the Mississippian world. Mississippian societies were more stratified than their Adena or Hopewell predecessors. While still spiritually based, they had clearer ruling elites, likely a class of priest leaders who claimed descent from the sun or ancestral deities. Archaeological evidence suggests the presence of status-based housing, with larger homes and imported goods for elites. Craft specialists, including potters, toolmakers, and ritual artists. Ritual feasting, held in plazas and accompanied by music, dance, and offerings. Complex burial practices, with elite individuals interred with thousands of shell beads, copper ornaments, and effigy vessels. One remarkable burial at the Mound 72 site in Cahokia revealed a central figure, laid on a bed of shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Dozens of other individuals, some sacrificed, buried nearby. Exotic items including mica, copper, and marine shells. This was not simple interment, it was symbolic performance, tying earthly rule to cosmic power. The Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Across Mississippian lands, symbols and motifs repeated with striking consistency. Scholars call this shared system of iconography and ritual the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, SECC. Common elements included the Birdman, a falcon-headed human or warrior, often linked to the upper world or sky realm. The Great Serpent or underwater panther, symbols of the lower world. Solar imagery, including cross and circles and concentric rings. Hands and eyes, often representing spiritual vision or power. These images adorned shell gorgets, copper plates, stone statues, ceremonial mounds. The SECC likely represented a cosmology involving 3 worlds. Upper world sky, sun, celestial power. Middle world earth, people, the living. Lower world water, ancestors, chaos. Rituals and mound construction helped maintain balance among these realms. Trade, power, and daily life. Cahokia and other Mississippian centers were nodes in a complex web of trade and communication. Goods moved across vast distances. Obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf and Atlantic, stone tools and salt from the Ozarks, chert and flint for projectile points. In daily life, most people lived in thatched houses clustered around communal spaces. They grew maize, beans, and squash in raised fields, tended flocks, and hunted. Social roles were likely well defined, with ritual specialists, warriors, craftspeople, and farmers all contributing to the city's maintenance. But it was ceremony tied to seasons, ancestors, and celestial cycles that knit everything together. Decline and dispersal. By around 1300 CE, Cahokia's population began to decline. The great city was largely abandoned by 1350 CE. Why? Environmental stress, deforestation, soil depletion, and local climate shifts may have reduced food supply. Social unrest, inequality, overcentralization, or religious conflict may have led to internal collapse. Flooding, the Mississippi River's cycles, may have damaged critical areas. Disease, some suggest early pandemics perhaps carried along trade routes. Whatever the causes, the decline was gradual. The knowledge did not vanish, it migrated. Descendants of the Mississippian tradition would later form historic native nations like the Natchez, Muskogee, Creek, Caddo, Choctaw, and Cherokee. They retained memories of mound sites and cosmological systems, even if colonial violence later suppressed many of those traditions. Colonial erasure and rediscovery. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many mounds had been plowed under or looted. Early European settlers and antiquarians often dismissed the idea that indigenous peoples had built them, instead attributing them to a lost race of mound builders. Ancient Europeans or Israelites. Theories steeped in racial bias and colonial justification. It wasn't until the late 19th century that archaeologists, many indigenous, began to correct the record, linking mounds to living native traditions. Today, sites like Cahokia, Etowah, Georgia, Spiro, Oklahoma, and Moundville, Alabama, are recognized as part of a shared ancestral landscape not vanished, but often overlooked. Mounds today, sacred memory and resistance. Many native communities continue to honor the mounds as places of ceremony and pilgrimage, as symbols of cultural resilience, as evidence of a sophisticated, land-based science and spirituality. In recent years, efforts have grown to protect mound sites from development, to return looted artifacts, and to restore indigenous stewardship of these ancient places. And as archaeologists use tools like LiDAR and aerial imaging, they're discovering that many more mounds once hidden under fields and forests still remain. The mounds are not dead monuments. They are living chapters of an unfinished story. Final reflection. So we walk again along the edge of Monk's Mound at sunset. The fields are quiet. A shadow stretches across the plaza. The wood posts of the old solar calendar have long rotted away, but the alignment remains. And we ask, what kind of civilization shapes the earth to follow the sky, not to dominate it, but to remember where we are in time and who we are in relation to it? Story 7. The roads beneath the trees, trade and travel in pre-Columbian America. When you imagine the Americas before 1492, it's easy to picture dense forests, vast plains, and scattered villages isolated, self-contained, and far apart. But that image misses something fundamental: movement. Before European arrival, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had already created a vast network of trails, roads, rivers, and trade routes, pathways that crisscrossed forests, mountains, and deserts. These routes didn't rely on wheels, beasts of burden, or asphalt. They were made of footsteps, river currents, and oral memory, linking people, goods, and stories across thousands of miles. In this first section of Story 7, we'll walk the hidden highways of the pre-Columbian Americas, focusing on foot trails and river routes east of the Mississippi. These were not simply ways to get from place to place, they were the circulatory system of a continent, carrying not just goods, but knowledge, languages, and ceremony. We begin not with maps, but with rhythms of walking, the crunch of forest leaves, and the curve of a paddle blade cutting through mist. The myth of isolation. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, historians and archaeologists often describe the indigenous peoples of North America as primitive, isolated, or nomadic. These outdated ideas ignored the abundant evidence of long-distance interaction and well-organized travel. Recent archaeological, linguistic, and ethnographic work reveals that there were well-established trade routes spanning thousands of miles. People traveled seasonally, not randomly, often visiting ceremonial centers, trade fairs, or diplomatic gatherings. Ideas and technologies from corn cultivation to copper tools spread widely across regions. Even without wheels or horses, prior to European contact, indigenous people had created a highly mobile society. Many of these routes have been forgotten not because they weren't important, but because they weren't made of stone. They were made of memory and repetition. Foot trails through the forest. In the eastern woodlands, vast forests once covered much of what is now the eastern United States. But within these forests, footpaths, well-worn, recognizable trails linked villages, rivers, and ceremonial sites. These trails were typically narrow, worn down by generations of walkers, cleared of major underbrush, and maintained by frequent use. Often followed ridgelines, avoiding swampy lowlands. Marked with subtle signs, bent saplings, carved trees, or stone piles. Some trails were regional, connecting neighboring communities. Others formed parts of continental networks, connecting distant ecological zones and cultural spheres. For example, the Great Indian Warpath, later used by colonists as the Great Wagon Road, stretched from the northeast down through the Appalachian Spine. The Natchez Trace connected the Mississippi River to the southeastern interior, now preserved as a modern parkway. Trails through the Ohio River Valley linked Hopewell and Mississippian cultures to the Great Lakes, Gulf Coast, and beyond. These were not incidental paths, they were intentional infrastructure. Traveling light, moving far. Without wheeled carts or draft animals, how did people move? On foot, carrying goods in tumplines, back baskets, or shoulder packs. Using canoes, which dramatically increased carrying capacity and speed. Traveling in groups, especially for longer journeys or ceremonial visits. Guided by wayfinders, individuals with deep knowledge of the land, seasons, and signs. People moved with purpose. They traveled to trade specialized goods, visit family or allies, attend ceremonies, seasonal games, or peace councils, gather rare resources, salt, flint, herbs, or sacred items, pass on messages, forming early diplomatic and news networks. The absence of wheels didn't limit travel, it shaped how travel worked, and emphasized endurance, knowledge, and memory. Rivers as roads. Alongside footpaths, rivers were the major highways of indigenous America. The Mississippi River and its tributaries formed a vast watery superhighway. The Great Lakes provided routes from the St. Lawrence River all the way to the plains. The Tennessee, Ohio, Susquehanna, and Hudson rivers all supported regular canoe traffic. Canoes varied by region. Birchbark canoes in the Northeast, light, fast, and ideal for portaging. Dugout canoes in the Southeast, carved from single logs, heavier but sturdy for wider rivers. Skin-covered boats among Arctic and subarctic peoples. Navigating rivers required skill, not just paddling, but reading currents, eddies, and portage points. Where rapids or falls blocked travel, portages were well known and maintained. Some portage routes became permanent overland trails, linking watersheds and forming the backbone of regional transportation. What was traded? Trade wasn't only about economic exchange, it was about relationships. Still, the range of traded goods was impressive. Obsidian, copper, mica, and pipestone for ceremonial use. Salt, which was mined or boiled from brine springs and used in food preservation. Shells from the Gulf and Atlantic, used for adornment and ritual. Textile, especially woven items and animal hides. Foodstuffs like dried corn, squash, smoked fish, and berries. Medicinal herbs and special clays. Cultural items, masks, pipes, tools, or musical instruments. But more than objects, what was traded included news and stories, songs and language, marriage alliances, diplomatic understandings. Each journey was a social act, a way of reinforcing ties and expanding knowledge. Ceremonial travel. Many trails led not just to towns, but to sacred centers, places of pilgrimage, ritual, and political gathering. Some examples: Cahokia in Illinois, a ceremonial capital drawing visitors from across the Midwest and Southeast. Etowah and Ocmulgee in Georgia, Mississippian mound centers that hosted seasonal games, feasts, and diplomacy. Chaco Canyon in the Southwest, connected by a network of roads to be covered in a later section. Effigy mounds, Serpent Mound, and other sacred landscapes, visited for ritual purposes. These gatherings might include solstice ceremonies, green corn festivals, storytelling, dancing, and feasting, marriage negotiations, or conflict resolution. Travel was therefore not just about commerce, it was spiritual, seasonal, and socially essential. Mapping without maps. One of the most remarkable features of these networks is that they were navigated without written maps. Instead, people relied on oral transmission, elders teaching routes and landmarks, environmental cues, trees, water patterns, bird migrations, and stars, mnemonic devices, songs, dances, and stories that encoded geographical knowledge, sacred landscapes, where myth and memory aligned with terrain. A journey might be remembered not as turn left, walk 5 miles, but as a story. Follow where the heron flies at sunset. When the cedar leans over the stream, you are near. This knowledge was shared, but often specific to certain groups, creating a network of keepers of the way. An unseen legacy. Much of this trail system was absorbed into later colonial infrastructure. Settlers expanded indigenous paths into roads and highways. Major cities often arose at ancient crossroads or trade hubs. Rivers used for steamboats and commerce had long been canoe routes. Modern interstates follow ancient footpaths, often unknowingly. But as colonization advanced, many trails were destroyed, obscured, or renamed. The knowledge held in songs and stories was silenced by boarding schools, forced relocation, and assimilation policies. Yet some trails remain. You can walk them quietly beneath canopies of oak and pine, along riverbanks or across ridgelands. And if you walk long enough, you might feel the rhythm of old footsteps, still moving under leaves. The question that remains: so we pause along a trail that cuts through forest and time. We imagine a traveler centuries ago, humming softly, carrying a bundle of stories, walking towards someone they've never met but already know. And we ask, if knowledge can be carried without books, and roads can exist without pavement, what else have we forgotten to see beneath our own feet? In Section 1, we walk the woodland trails and river routes of the eastern woodlands. These silent highways made of footsteps, memory, and water remind us that indigenous peoples were not static or isolated, but deeply interconnected across vast distances. Now in Section 2, we continue our journey westward and southward, following continental trade networks that link the Great Plains, the Southwest, and even parts of Mesoamerica. We'll explore how goods, ideas, and rituals flowed freely across what today are modern political boundaries, but which, in pre-Columbian times, were porous cultural zones rather than walls. We'll also examine the role of specialized traders, the portals of exchange where different worlds met, and how trade was as much about ceremony and cosmology as economics. What we find is a sophisticated, adaptable system of exchange, one that challenges the myth of indigenous societies as scattered or primitive. These were people who crossed deserts and mountains not just to barter, but to connect, honor, and remember. The web of exchange. Imagine North America not as a blank map, but as a woven web. Threads of rivers, ridges, and trails stretch from the forests of the Northeast to the deserts of the Southwest. Along these threads move obsidian, turquoise, copper, feathers, salt, bison robe, shells, pigments, and sacred stories. Each node, each village, mound center, or ceremonial site functions not just as a home, but as a hub in a vast network. This system had no fixed borders, no passports, no formal currencies, but it had rules, customs, and protocols passed through generations of diplomats, traders, and spiritual emissaries. These routes were resilient. They adapted to shifting climates, alliances, and empires. They lasted for centuries. Plains paths trade across the grasslands. East of the Rocky Mountains lies the Great Plains, a region often portrayed as empty or nomadic. But it was, in fact, crisscrossed with ancient trade routes. Key trade patterns included north-south routes, connecting the northern plains, Dakotas, Manitoba, to the southern plains, Texas, Oklahoma, with goods moving between bison hunting cultures and farming societies. East-west corridors, linking Mississippian towns like Spiro and Etowah to the Puebloan cultures of the Southwest. River highways, especially the Missouri River, which served as a major trade artery. Important goods traded on the plains. Bison hides and robes, prized for warmth and ritual use. Pipestone from Minnesota, carved into sacred pipes. Horse gear and captives, post-1500s, after the introduction of horses by the Spanish. Foods and seeds, including corn, beans, and squash, traded from farming villages to nomadic groups. The plains were not margins, they were the middle ground, where nomadic and sedentary cultures met, exchanged, and intermarried. Southwestern roads, Chaco and beyond. In the American Southwest, between 900 and 1150 CE, the Chaco Canyon region became a center of ceremonial exchange. From there, roads radiated out across hundreds of miles, some still visible today, etched into desert stone. The Chaco system included over 400 miles of engineered roads, some up to 30 feet wide, connecting Chaco to outlying great houses. Trade routes that extended into what is now Mexico, California, and the plains. Architectural alignments that tracked solstices and equinoxes, suggesting trade was tied to ceremonial calendars. Goods found in Chaco include macaws and copper, bells from Mesoamerica. Obsidian and turquoise, used in jewelry and ritual. Ceramic vessels painted, polished, and shared across regions. Salt and textiles from local and distant sources. Chaco was not just a town, it was a cosmic observatory, trade hub, and ritual pilgrimage site. And it was not alone. Sites like Mesa Verde, Hohokam Canals, and Casa Grande were also part of this rich tapestry of desert trade and ceremony. Shells from the sea, feathers from the jungle. Among the most widespread traded items in pre-Columbian America were marine shells, particularly Bizican and olive shells from the Gulf Coast and Atlantic whelk. These shells were carved into beads, gorgets, and breastplates. used in burial ritual across the eastern woodlands and Midwest, sometimes arranged into cosmological patterns symbolizing wind, water, or fertility. Feathers, too, were highly valued. Macaw feathers, red, yellow, green, were imported into the Southwest from tropical zones. Eagle and hawk feathers held spiritual power across many cultures. Turkey feathers were woven into robes and blankets, especially in the Four Corners area. These items were not just beautiful. They were sacred media carrying meaning across generations and geographies. Portals of exchange, trade fairs, and sacred markets. Trade did not always happen in quiet, one-on-one exchanges. There were also seasonal gatherings, trade fairs, and ceremonial marketplaces. At these events, goods were exchanged through gift economies, not bartering. Dance, song, and ritual diplomacy governed interaction. News, stories, and songs were shared along with goods. Intermarriage helped form new kinship ties and alliances. Some known or suspected trade gathering sites include Spiro Mounds, Oklahoma, with artifacts linking it to both the Southeast and Southwest. Etowah, Georgia, a ceremonial hub with rich trade artifacts. Green corn festivals in the Southeast, often associated with trade and diplomacy. Such events made trade into a cultural performance not about profit, but about belonging. Borderless worlds, trade with Mesoamerica. While much of North American trade stayed within its own spheres, there is evidence of contact with Mesoamerica. Macaws, cacao, and copper bells found in Chaco Canyon and other southwestern sites likely came from central or southern Mexico. Mesoamerican obsidian appears in North American sites. Mound-building traditions, like those of the Olmec and Maya, share similarities with Mississippian structures, though this may be parallel development rather than direct influence. Some scholars propose a North American interaction sphere, akin to what Mesoamerica had. It wasn't a single empire or cultural group, it was a constellation of relationships, continually forming and reforming over time. Travelers and translators. The success of these networks depended on individuals who served as intermediaries, the unsung figures of history. Traders who specialized in long-distance travel. Diplomats who could navigate multiple languages and customs. Shamans and spiritual guides, carrying ritual knowledge across cultural zones. Storytellers who remembered the details of paths, prices, and protocols. These were not anonymous walkers. They were connectors moving through regions where language shifted every 100 miles, but where shared signs and ceremonial bonds allowed communication. Trade as ceremony. At every level, trade was more than just economics. It was ceremony. Every journey was marked with ritual before, during, and after. Exchanges were accompanied by songs, prayers, or gifts. Certain items like sacred pipes or vision bundles were never traded casually. Trading itself could serve as a kind of peacemaking or remembrance of ancient kinship. This ceremonial aspect meant that the landscape itself became a ritual space. Trails weren't just dirt, they were lines of connection between people, ancestors, and the cosmos. What gets left out of the map? Today, we mark national borders, highways, and air routes on maps. But the old indigenous networks have no markers. They are found in oral traditions, archaeological clues, and in the alignment of memory and place. They remain in the roadbeds beneath modern streets, the shell beads in old graves, far from the ocean, the linguistic echoes of trade words across languages, the stories still told by indigenous elders about the roads their ancestors walked. These networks challenge our definitions of civilization, economy, and connectivity. They ask us to imagine a continent unbounded by fences, but richly mapped in footsteps, kinship, and sky. An open path. So we follow a trader, hundreds of years ago, making her way from the river to the mountains. She carries turquoise, dried squash, a carved pipe, and a story. She'll stay for a season, maybe marry, maybe leave behind a child who remembers her language. And we ask, if a road is not paved, but remembered if it crosses rivers and rituals, rather than borders, can we still call it forgotten? In sections 1 and 2, we walked the trails and canoed the rivers of ancient North America. We traveled from the Appalachian ridges to the Mississippi's oxbows, from Chaco's sun-baked roads to Spiro's river-crossed mound plazas. These were not isolated places, but intersections of commerce, ceremony, and kinship, unseen arteries that moved with memory, not asphalt. In this final section, we turn to the fate of those ancient roads. What happened to them after European colonization? How did settler expansion, land seizure, and forced removals impact the indigenous geography of movement? And what of today? Can these routes be recovered, walked again, and remembered? This is a story of interruption, but also of resilience. Though many of the roads were erased from maps, they were not erased from memory. And in the quiet efforts of communities, scholars, and walkers, the old paths stir once more. The colonial disruption. When Europeans arrived in the 1500s and 1600s, they did not enter an empty land, they entered a well-connected world. But their arrival brought profound change. Diseases, especially smallpox, decimated populations and disrupted trade networks. Colonial wars reoriented alliances, often breaking older exchange systems. Missions and forts replaced sacred gathering places with centers of control. Maps redrew indigenous landscapes with foreign names and borders. New trade items, iron tools, guns, glass beads flooded indigenous markets, reshaping values and relationships. Despite these disruptions, indigenous trade continued, but it often had to adapt to the demands and dangers of European interests. The landscape shifted from a web of sacred trails to a system of colonial roads, often built atop the very paths they sought to erase. Trails turned turnpikes. Many of today's major roads began as native trails. Examples include the Natchez Trace, originally an indigenous footpath used by the Natchez, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. It was later formalized by the U.S. government and is now a scenic highway. The Great Wagon Road began as the Great Indian Warpath through the Appalachians. It became a key route for settlers moving southward. U.S. Route 1 and Highway 11 trace parts of ancient trails used by eastern nations like the Powhatan and Iroquois. Buffalo Trace, Indiana, originally a game trail, then a native footpath, then a pioneer route. These roads often preserved the direction, but lost the meaning. The songs, stops, and ceremonies that once marked the way were forgotten or suppressed. Trails removed from the land. The trauma of forced removals, especially in the 19th century, further fractured the memory of ancient roads. The Trail of Tears, 1830s, forcibly relocated the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw from their homelands in the southeast to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Along these forced marches, thousands died. The old roads became routes of grief, not exchange. Many sacred landscapes, mounds, river crossings, forest paths were left behind or destroyed. Government allotment policies in the West further fractured communal landholding and obscured ancient trails beneath fences and fields. In many places, the roads were no longer walked. They were buried under the weight of colonial memory. But not entirely. Survivals and secret memories. Even amid devastation, oral tradition preserved fragments of the roads. Elders remembered place names, even if the places themselves were gone. Ceremonial calendars still reflected journeys once made on foot. Dream songs, used in vision quests and healing, sometimes referenced trails and crossroads. Some trails remained in hunting paths, seasonal pilgrimages, or church camp meetings that repurposed old gathering spots. In Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and the desert Southwest, traditional canoe routes continued well into the 20th century. In the Andes and Central America, footpaths once used by traders and messengers chasquis still crisscrossed highlands and valleys, followed by farmers and herders. The roads were quiet but not gone, walking backward to move forward. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a new movement began: reclamation of indigenous trails. These efforts include 1. Historic trail projects. Organizations and tribal nations have collaborated to document and preserve pre-Columbian routes. GPS mapping, archaeological research, and traditional knowledge combine to restore path alignments. The National Park Service now includes some native trails in its system, though often without full cultural context. 2. Language revitalization and toponyms. Indigenous place names are being restored to maps, bringing back the geographical memory embedded in words. For example, Mashpee, Massachusetts, Okmulgee, Muskogee, and Tamalpais, Coast Miwok, reflect the older roadways of water and forest. 3. Pilgrimage and remembrance walks. Some communities conduct annual walks to retrace ancient or traumatic routes, such as the Trail of Tears commemorative walk. Others use walks as ceremonial acts, a form of healing, renewal, or resistance. These efforts are not just historical, they are acts of sovereignty, reclaiming space and time. The roads as more than movement. One of the most profound truths about these roads is that they were not just physical. They were also metaphysical. In many indigenous traditions, the path is a sacred metaphor, for life, for balance, for learning. Stories often speak of walking the good road, or keeping the trail, meaning to stay aligned with ancestors, values, and cosmology. Roads appear in vision quests, where the seeker must choose between trails. Even the Milky Way is called the Spirit Road, or Path of Souls, in multiple cultures a celestial version of the earthly trail. To restore a trail, then, is not just to rebuild a path, it is to reawaken a worldview. A landscape remembered. Archaeologists using LiDAR technology are now discovering long-lost roadbeds, even beneath forests and cities. In Louisiana, roads once linked Poverty Point to distant settlements. In Florida, shell roads made from crushed marine material trace the Gulf Coast. In the Four Corners, Chacon roads have been found stretching straight through mesas, defying modern logic, but following ritual lines. Some of these roads are now being preserved. Others are vanishing again under subdivisions and strip malls. But a growing number of people, indigenous and non-indigenous, are learning to listen for their echoes. Final reflection. So we find ourselves once again on a quiet trail. Maybe it's a modern path, maybe it's ancient, maybe it's both. A breeze moves through the trees. A bird calls. Somewhere, someone is walking not to get somewhere, but to remember. And we ask, if the earth remembers where we walked, and the stars remember where we looked, what do we owe the paths that carried us even when we forgot they were there? Story 8. The Frozen Frontiers, Arctic Survival, and the Ingenious Inuit World. If you were to find yourself standing on the frozen edge of the North American continent in the year 1400, the wind would cut across your face like a knife, and the sun, low and distant on the horizon, might only barely illuminate the snow beneath your feet. The temperature could drop to 50 degrees below zero. The land, if you could call it that, might be shifting sea ice. No trees, no soil, no roads, just white, a blinding, endless white. And yet people lived here, thrived here, built homes, raised children, and passed down stories longer than winter itself. In this first section of Story 8, we begin our journey into the pre-Columbian Arctic world, focusing on the Inuit and their ancestors, the Thule people. We'll explore what it meant to survive and build a society in one of the world's harshest environments, not with abundance, but with adaptation, knowledge, and ingenuity. Forget grand monuments or cities. Here, civilization is measured by a well-sewn parka, the precision of a harpoon, and the memory of the ice. The Arctic world, geography of extremes. To understand Inuit survival, we must first understand the Arctic. This vast region spans the northern coasts of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, island chains like the Arctic archipelago, the Bering Strait connecting to Siberia, seasonal sea ice that expands and contracts like a living creature. In summer, light never leaves the sky. In winter, darkness never lifts. Vegetation is sparse. Trees don't grow this far north. The land is tundra, permafrost, moss, lichens, and short-lived blooms. Rivers freeze solid for half the year. The sea becomes a platform, then a hazard, then a lifeline again. And yet the Arctic is not empty. It teems with life. Seals, especially ringed and bearded varieties. Whales, including bowhead, narwhal, and beluga. Caribou migrating across the tundra. Fish, seabirds, and polar bears. The Inuit didn't just survive this world. They became specialists in reading its signs, animal movements, weather shifts, ice conditions, and celestial cues. Their knowledge wasn't written in books, it was walked into the snow, sung into memory, and carved into bone. The Thule ancestors. The Thule culture, pronounced Thule, emerged around 1000 CE, migrating eastward from Alaska into what is now Arctic Canada and Greenland. They were the ancestors of the modern Inuit. Key features of Thule life included large skin-covered boats, umiak, used to hunt whales. Dog sleds for long-distance land travel. Semi-subterranean houses built of whale bones, stone, and sod. Sophisticated harpoon technology for marine hunting. Seasonal mobility, shifting camps based on ice and animal patterns. By 1400, the Thule had replaced earlier Arctic peoples, such as the Dorset culture, and established a pan-Arctic presence. This wasn't conquest, it was adaptation. They brought new technologies and subsistence strategies better suited to a changing climate. Their settlements were small, scattered, but connected by sea routes, shared knowledge, and kinship ties that spanned thousands of miles. Shelter, houses carved from necessity. In an environment where exposure meant death, shelter was not optional, it was life. The Thule and Inuit built different kinds of houses depending on the season. Winter houses, dug partially into the ground for insulation. Framed with whale bones or driftwood, covered in sod or snow. Single-room dwellings with stone lamps for light and warmth. Floors lined with skins, and sleeping areas elevated on platforms. Shared by extended families, privacy was limited, but warmth was shared. These structures could last for years, reused or repaired annually. Snow houses, igloos, used mainly for temporary winter shelter during hunting expeditions. Built entirely from blocks of packed snow, cut with bone or ivory knives. Ingeniously designed, spiral construction, self-supporting domes. Interior warmed by body heat and a single lamp. Could be built in under an hour by a skilled person. Contrary to popular myth, not all Inuit lived in igloos full-time, but the igloo as engineering is a testament to human ingenuity. Snow, once considered hostile, became the building block of survival. Food, hunting, the breath of the sea. There was no farming in the Arctic, no grains, no herds to domesticate. Instead, survival depended on marine mammals, especially the seal. Hunting seals involved identifying seal-breathing holes in the sea ice, called a glue. Waiting motionless for hours, sometimes entire days, for a seal to surface. Using silent weapons like the toggle harpoon, which embedded under the skin. Pulling the animal up through the ice, sometimes weighing over 100 pounds. Other critical food sources. Whale meat and blubber, especially from bowhead whales. Caribou hunted during their migrations. Bird eggs in summer and fish through ice holes. Foraged plants in brief warm seasons, berries, roots, and lichens. Every part of the animal was used. The blubber lit lamps. The hide clothed bodies. The bones became tools. This was not wasteful survival. It was circular ecology, respectful, efficient, and based on generations of observation. Technology without metal. Before the introduction of European goods, Inuit technology was entirely non-metallic, yet incredibly advanced. Some innovations included harpoons with detachable heads and toggle points for marine hunting. Ulu knives, crescent-shaped, used by women for skinning and food prep. Sinew thread, stronger than modern nylon, used in precise sewing. Bone needles, drilled and polished with precision. Snow goggles made of bone or wood, with narrow slits to reduce glare. Kayaks, lightweight and sealed, for single-person sea travel. Dog sleds, lashed together with no nails or screws. Even in the absence of metal, glass, or plastics, the Inuit created a technological system that worked seamlessly with the Arctic. Sewing, for example, wasn't just a domestic task, it was engineering. A poorly sewn parka could mean death in a blizzard. Community, the bonds that bind. In the vastness of the Arctic, social cohesion was everything. Groups often consisted of extended families, sometimes numbering 20-40 people. Sharing was not just moral, it was practical. Food, warmth, and labor were communal. Decision-making was consensual, often led by elders or respected hunters. Shamans Angakuk served as spiritual leaders and healers. Song, stories, and games were central to passing time and knowledge. Isolation could be deadly, so people cultivated tight-knit, interdependent societies where roles were respected and memory was shared. Children learned survival skills from a young age, not through punishment, but through observation, play, and story. Survival as story. In a world with few permanent markers, oral tradition was the map. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals. Tales about animals taught hunting ethics and ecology. Myths explained celestial movement and seasonal shifts. Fables warned against pride, greed, or ignoring the spirits of the land. Names of places encoded practical knowledge, where to find fish when ice breaks, where storms gather. Inuit cosmology did not separate the practical from the spiritual. Everything was alive: the ice, the sea, the animals. To survive, you had to live in harmony, not conquest. A quiet mastery. By 1400, the Inuit and their Thule ancestors had developed a way of life so well suited to their environment that it would remain largely unchanged for centuries. While empires rose and fell further south, Arctic peoples perfected self-sufficiency without agriculture, mobility without wheels or beasts of burden, architecture without timber or stone, social order without written laws, navigation without compasses. It was a different kind of civilization, silent, small-scale, but immensely skilled. An unfinished journey. So we stand again on the edge of the sea ice. The sun is returning after a long night. A hunter waits by a breathing hole. A child traces patterns in the snow, humming the old stories. And we ask, what does it mean to be advanced not in monuments or armies, but in the art of listening to wind, to ice, and to ancestors? We explored the brilliance of Arctic survival, how the Inuit and their Thule ancestors transformed scarcity into sustainability and cold into community. But their story doesn't end with endurance. The Arctic was not a land of isolated camps waiting out the snow. It was a landscape of motion measured not by miles of road, but by sled tracks, sea lanes, and the paths carved into memory. Now in Section 2, we focus on how people moved and connected in the Arctic. We'll explore the extensive use of dog sleds and boats, the network of seasonal migrations, social exchange systems like trade and marriage alliances. Information flow across thousands of miles of tundra and sea. Despite the harsh conditions, or perhaps because of them, Inuit communities became expert navigators of distance, not just physical, but social. Travel across the tundra. In a land with few landmarks and often no trails, travel required an extraordinary sense of orientation. The Inuit developed methods that relied on keen observation, celestial navigation, and oral mapping. Key travel modes included 1. Dog sleds Kamutik, introduced by the Thule around 1000 CE. Sleds were made from driftwood or bone, with crossbars lashed together using sealskin. Teams of 6-12 dogs pulled the sleds, often led by a single lead dog trained to respond to voice and gesture. Travel could cover 20-40 miles a day, depending on conditions. Used for long-distance journeys, hunting expeditions, moving camps, or visiting kin. 2 boats. Umiak, large open boats, framed with driftwood and covered with sealskin, used by women and families to move camp. Kayak, sleek, enclosed sea craft used by men for stealth hunting and quick travel. Both could navigate open water, shifting ice flows and narrow inlets. 3. On foot and snowshoes. Walking remained essential, especially when snow was soft or the dogs tired. Snowshoes were used in the boreal fringe regions, allowing for long treks in deep powder. Travelers learned to read the snow surface. Hardness, layering, drift shape all told stories of wind and danger. Every form of travel came with embedded knowledge: where to find safe ice, how to read the stars and wind, and how to recognize danger before it struck. Seasonal migrations and mobility. The Arctic way of life was built on rhythm's seasonal pulses that dictated where people would be and when. Most Inuit groups were semi-nomadic, moving between seasonal camps. A typical annual cycle might look like: spring, move to coastal camps to hunt seals as they bask on the sea ice. Summer, travel inland or along rivers to hunt caribou, fish, and gather berries. Fall, prepare for winter, drying meat, repairing shelters, making clothing. Winter, settle in semi-permanent houses, often near Palanya's open water, where seals could be hunted under the ice. Movement wasn't aimless, it was carefully coordinated with resource availability and environmental cycles. Different families or bands might follow slightly different patterns depending on their territory, but all relied on intimate knowledge of landscape and timing: when the caribou crossed the river, when the ice thickened enough to travel, when the sun would return. Trade and exchange, more than goods. Despite vast distances between communities, the Inuit maintained extensive networks of exchange, not only of materials, but of information, alliances, and relationships. What was traded? Stone tools and materials, including flint, soapstone, and even meteoric iron. Food, dried fish, seal meat, fat, caribou. Crafts, ivory carvings, bone tools, dolls, and containers. Clothing items, particularly finely sewn parkas or boots. Stories and songs, essential for building bonds and passing on history. But trade wasn't impersonal. It was often built on kinship or marriage alliances, where gifts and obligations passed between extended families. Giving was an act of respect. Reciprocity wasn't expected immediately, but remembered sometimes over generations. These exchanges reinforced peaceful coexistence and ensured that no group was truly alone in hard times. Interactions beyond the Inuit. The Arctic was not cut off from the rest of the world. The Thule and Inuit likely had contact with other indigenous groups to the south and west, including Dene-speaking peoples in subarctic regions, Yupik and Aleut groups in western Alaska, and even through long exchange chains, cultural contact with Pacific and interior nations. Later, with the arrival of Europeans in the 1500s and beyond, new trade dynamics emerged. The Inuit obtained metal tools, guns, and cloth. In return, Europeans sought furs, especially fox and seal. Encounters were not always peaceful, but early contact was often limited and seasonal, especially in Greenland and Labrador. By the 1400s, however, European contact was still minimal in many Arctic areas. The Inuit lived in a world shaped primarily by their own knowledge, relationships, and roots. Information networks, oral maps, and memory. Without writing systems or physical maps, the Inuit created an oral cartography of extraordinary sophistication. Landmarks were memorized not just as shapes, but as stories. Navigation involved songs, with each verse corresponding to a bend in the coastline or a mountain shape. Story cycles might encode entire migration paths or seasonal calendars. Place names were descriptive, precise, and often sacred naming features that had no equivalents in settler languages. Information traveled through visits, marriages, feasts, and rituals. A hunter might bring news of a good seal patch 100 miles away. A guest from a distant camp might share warnings of a changing ice pattern or a new method of crafting snow goggles. In this way, the Arctic was not isolated villages, but a talking landscape, humming with shared awareness. Cooperation and conflict. Like all societies, Inuit communities were not utopias. There were disputes over hunting grounds, personal slights, or trade disagreements. However, conflict resolution was embedded in the culture. Mediation by elders. Song duels, a public contest of insults, wit, and skill used to resolve disputes without violence. Shamanic guidance, where spiritual interpretations could reframe a conflict. Social sanction, including temporary exclusion or shamming. Physical violence was rare, in part because survival required cooperation. One person's food might save the next family tomorrow. The harsh environment made shared survival not just ethical, but necessary. Social webs across the ice. Taken together, the Inuit world in 1400 was a vast, dynamic social web. Despite the apparent isolation of each camp, communities were deeply interconnected. Through travel, dogs, boats, and walking. Through seasonal movement, hunting, gathering, and social visits. Through exchange of goods, services, and ceremony. Through memory, oral knowledge that tied places together like beads on a line. What emerges is not a picture of frozen isolation, but of ice-bound connectivity, fragile, flexible, and enduring. The unfinished map. So we trace an invisible line across the sea ice. It has no markers, no signposts, but someone long ago walked it again and again. Their sled runners carved a groove. Their voice left a song in the air. Their presence turned a blank expanse into a home. And we ask, if a map is not drawn, but remembered if it lives in people, rather than paper, how far can it carry a culture across the centuries? We walked the snowbound paths of pre-Columbian Inuit life, tracing how people built homes of ice, tracked seals under the sea ice, and maintained wide networks of trade and kinship across vast distances. But survival in the Arctic was never only about food, shelter, or mobility. In this final section, we turn to the inner landscape, the cosmology, belief systems, and spiritual frameworks that sustained Inuit society. Because in a world where the environment could turn deadly in moments, meaning mattered as much as meat. And beneath the surface of every breath hole, snowstorm, and aurora, there existed another world unseen but always near. The Inuit knew how to navigate both. The sacred web of relationships. At the heart of Inuit spirituality lies one central idea: everything is alive and everything is connected. This is not just a poetic metaphor, it is a practical philosophy, deeply embedded in every action. The seal was not just a food source, but a being with spirit and will. The ice was not inert, but responsive. It could protect, punish, or speak. Tools, songs, animals, Even words all had a kind of animacy. This worldview is sometimes called animism, but in Inuit terms, it's closer to what they describe as Silituinak, the intelligence and awareness that pervades the world. To survive was not just to conquer the land, but to coexist with it in constant relationship, shaped by respect, ritual, and restraint. The role of the Angakuk shaman. Inuit communities did not have priests or churches in the Western sense, but they did have spiritual specialists, the Angakuk plural, Angakuit. An Angakuk was a healer, a dream interpreter, a mediator between the human world and the spirits, a keeper of taboos and traditional knowledge. Angakuit might be called through visions, inherit the role from family, or be recognized after recovering from illness or strange behavior. Some were feared, most were respected. They used drum dances, chanting, and spirit journeys, often entering trances to consult or confront the spirit world. Their guidance could determine the success of a hunt, the cause of a storm, or the reason behind a sickness. But theirs was not a rigid authority. Angakuit coexisted with the knowledge of elders, hunters, and women, all of whom carried different forms of wisdom. Taboos, balance, and the law of respect. In the Arctic, the natural and spiritual worlds were tightly bound. To violate one was to anger the other. Taboos, called pikwajate, were sets of rules, sometimes seasonal, sometimes constant, that governed hunting behavior, never mocking a killed animal. Food preparation, keeping land and sea mammals separate. Gender roles in tasks, not from hierarchy but from ritual roles. Waste disposal, bones and remains had to be treated properly. Animal spirits, ensuring gratitude and offerings were made. Breaking taboos didn't bring punishment in the human sense. It brought imbalanced sickness, poor hunting, dangerous weather. The universe responded, and only ritual could restore harmony. These rules weren't arbitrary. They formed a moral ecology, a system that ensured careful use of resources, sustainable hunting, and respect for the unseen. Myths of ice and breath. Inuit oral literature is rich, dark, and filled with layers of meaning. Myths were not just stories, they were memory, map, and manual all at once. Some core themes include 1. Sedna, the Sea Mother, the most important figure in Inuit mythology. Once a human girl, betrayed and cast into the sea. She became the ruler of sea animals, seals, whales, walrus. If disrespected, she would tangle the sea ice or hide the animals. Shamans had to travel to her underworld, comb her hair, and make peace. Sedna is not a forgiving goddess. She reflects the harsh, conditional generosity of the sea. 2. The Moon Man and Sun Woman. Siblings or lovers, separated by fire or violence. The sun eternally flees, the moon eternally chases. This explains the cycles of day and night in the polar sky. A myth of longing, light, and cosmic motion. 3. The Spirit of the Bear. The polar bear Nanuk was seen as part human. Killing a bear required complex rituals and apologies. Its spirit could return, watching how the hunter treated its remains. If properly honored, it might give itself again. Each myth was localized, told differently across regions, families, and generations, but all carried a deep sense of consequence and reverence. Death, the soul, and the afterworld. The Inuit believed in multiple souls. One stayed in the body. Another traveled on. A third could remain near the family. When a person died, their name might be passed to a newborn, giving part of their soul new life. Their tools and clothes were sometimes buried with them or gifted away. Certain taboos around the house might follow for a time. The afterlife varied by region, but often included Quidlivan, a beautiful land beneath the sea or ice, where the dead lived in comfort. Adlivan, a temporary underworld, ruled by Sedna, where spirits waited before release. Some stories included rebirth, others spoke of wandering spirits. The boundary between life and death was permeable. The dead visited dreams. They spoke through animals. They could help or hinder the living. Ceremony in a harsh land. In a world where survival demanded constant work, formal ceremony was rare but powerful. Some examples: naming ceremonies, welcoming a child with the name and spirit of a deceased relative. First kill rituals, honoring a child's first successful hunt with shared food and blessings. Drum dances, communal gatherings with music, storytelling, sometimes song duels. Seasonal feasts, marking solstices, migrations, or celestial events. Even silence could be ceremonial. A well-timed pause, a moment of respect before a hunt, a glance at the stars. Meaning was not always declared. Often it was felt. Continuity through crisis. By 1400, the Inuit world had reached an extraordinary balance of body, land, and spirit. But that balance would be tested. In the centuries to come, European whalers would arrive with guns, alcohol, and foreign diseases. Missionaries would seek to replace shamans and oral tradition with Bibles. Government policies would move Inuit into permanent settlements. Dog sleds would be replaced by snowmobiles, sealskin by synthetic gear. Languages and stories would begin to vanish, erased not by cold, but by colonization. And yet, the heart of the Inuit world endures. It lives in elders who remember, in children learning their names, in hunters reading the ice, in a story told in a whisper across the snow. Final reflection. So we return once more to the edge of the ice. A hunter looks into the distance not just for seals but for signs. The wind shifts. Somewhere a spirit moves. The world is not silent, it is speaking always. And we ask, in a world where everything listens, what stories do we tell with our footsteps, and which ones do we forget?